Chapter 351, Armistice. Historically speaking, at least from the perspective of Bruno's past life, Kaiser Wilhelm II had been boastful, temperamental, and in many cases, belligerent. As if he had a chip on his shoulder due to a birth defect he suffered from. The man in that life had been rather difficult to work with, especially when it came to the British, who he in many ways had a desire to prove to be better than. This was not the case in this life. Many of the personality changes which Bruno noticed had been present in the Wilhelm of this timeline were no doubt to a greater degree of self-confidence resulting from the mere fact one of his arms was not vastly shorter than the other. This was a birth defect he had suffered from in Bruno's past life, and if the historical record was to be believed, had nothing to do with his genetics, but rather was the result of the way he had rested in his room, stunting the limb's growth. It was a crippling condition, one that had allegedly inwardly caused many emotional problems for the Kaiser. Perhaps God had changed this fact within the timeline, as he had also made several other minor alterations in order to give Bruno a better chance at changing the world for the better. Frankly speaking, Bruno did not know, nor did he really care for the reason why these subtle changes existed. But what he did know was that the negotiations between Britain and France perhaps would be much smoother this time around than they were in his past life. Unfortunately, Bruno himself was not called to act as counsel for the Kaiser, at least not at first. King George had after all agreed to meet with his cousin so long as they were alone and on neutral ground. King George V sat across from Kaiser Wilhelm II. Both men were in very different states of emotion. The Kaiser, perhaps elated with how dominantly his armed forces had demolished the pride of the British Navy on the seas and massacred the British Army on the land, was in a rather jovial mood, while King George V looked haggard and aged. The stress he was under these last few weeks as he single-handedly began taking over affairs that were normally handled by Parliament and enacting policies to try to put out the fires which burned across his empire had been enough to age him by several years. In fact, the moment he realized his German counterpart did not appear the least bit affected by the war, his expression grew sour, compelling the man to call out Wilhelm on his rather pristine appearance. "Well, don't you look healthy and vibrant? I would have assumed this war and the suffering your people have endured would have taken a far greater toll on you, but it appears I was mistaken in that regard." Had it been in Bruno's past life, Wilhelm might have jumped at the bait to insult his cousin with his need to prove his superiority. Or perhaps he might have taken offense to the implication that he did not care the slightest bit about his people, enough that the stress of their misery had not affected his appearance. But the man had learned a lot from Bruno over the years. There were indeed times to be ruthless and flaunt your strength, but that was not at the onset of negotiations. To do so would set a tone that would only provoke the hostile power into acting with stubbornness, and getting the British to surrender here and now, rather than fight until the bitter end to protect the French, was paramount to Germany's plans for the future. As a result, the Kaiser seemed completely unaffected by his cousin's spiteful words, and instead acted responsibly. "Oh, I assure you, cousin, we each have our crosses to bear. But let us not speak of who has suffered more than whom these past few years. Such a discussion is pointless and only serves to deepen whatever animosity may currently lie between us. No? I am offering you terms that I think you will find quite favorable. Though your ministers provoked me into a naval arms race that lasted the better part of 20 years, as far as I am concerned, we have won that war already, and there is no point to flaunt my victory here and now. Perhaps in the past, I would have been persuaded by men among my inner circle to make great demands of your colonial territories, but the truth be told, I am starting to rethink such ventures. This war has taught me the price that is associated with protecting lands far away from home, and I have you to thank for that. I suppose if we had been fortunate enough to have as many colonial possessions as you currently have now, then by all means it would be I in your shoes at this moment. As a result, I do not ask for colonial territories of any kind, nor any soil from your homeland. I am sure the amount in reparations can be discussed, as you have indeed caused quite some damages to the lands your men have invaded. But that would be a discussion for the House of Luxembourg and the King of Belgium to have with you. Me personally, representing the interests of the German Reich, I want your armies to stand down and withdraw from any theaters of war or combat zones they may currently be involved with. I want your formal surrender, and to also immediately cease any other forms of aid that the British Empire and its citizens may currently be granted to the Allied powers, either directly or indirectly, privately or publicly. It ends here and now. Today, that is my largest request. Agree to this, and we can proceed towards a proper and formal negotiation between the British Empire and the aggrieved parties of the Central Powers. What do you say? King George was stunned by the request that the Kaiser was making of him. He thought at the very least Germany would demand reparations to be paid out to the families of the men slain in battle and the damage done to their colonial territories. But Wilhelm was offering him a white peace, to cease hostilities without expecting anything of one another. For a man who had done everything except march his armies straight into the British capital, this was an unusual request, as more often than not when in the position of strength that Germany had, they would demand everything they could realistically get. King George realized he would have to be a damned fool to not accept a white peace, especially when this war had already taken such a massive toll on the British Empire. A fool or an absolute madman, who could spit in the face of such a generous offer and chastise the man who tried to broker it with a formal declaration of his intent to fight to the bitter end. Despite knowing that some form of compensation would have to be paid to Luxembourg and Belgium, of whom suffered the most damage at the hands of the British Empire during the war, Wilhelm's opening offer of a white peace from the get-go made the King of England far more inclined towards entertaining such negotiations rather than continuing with the war altogether. And because of that, he was quick to agree to a formal conference to discuss the formal surrender of the British Empire from the war altogether and its withdrawing from the Allied powers as a whole. All right, I'll do as you ask. I will begin to withdraw my men and supplies from the front lines in the Western Front, while immediate giving the order for all forces to surrender within colonial territories. As for the British Navy, it will stand down the moment these discussions are over. In exchange, I expect you to stop hunting our trade convoys and any other aggression your troops might take toward the British Empire. This includes arming, training, giving safe haven, and supplying any potential rebellious entities within our realm. Agreed. The Kaiser did not outright admit to doing the last part of what the King of England had indirectly accused him of, but he was quick to accept the terms, nonetheless. Then, under these terms, we officially have an armistice until the official treaty negotiations can begin. As for France, we are still considered in a state of war against them until they too come to the negotiating table. And any British citizens who have decided to stay behind and volunteer to fight for the French will be considered enemy combatants and will naturally be treated as such. I look forward to meeting with you again when the time comes to do so. Until then, do take care, cousin. After saying this, Wilhelm left his cousin George to sit in silence, as the man sighed heavily and reflected on how the British Empire ended up in such a sorry state. Chapter 352. Unwavering Spirit of Resistance. The French Republic did not take the news of their last major ally withdrawing from the war very well. The British Empire had agreed to enter the war on the side of the French as a show of strength and solidarity against an increasingly powerful German Reich. This was the result of past enemies and formal alliances being built by the Germans with powerful states, as well as the Germans securing military agreements and trade with the Empire of Japan at the exclusion of the British Empire. After a series of disastrous pushes against the front lines of Belgium and Alsace-Lothringen, as well as the Battle of Ypres, which had resulted in the deaths of 1 million men in total, by the time disease and rot sank deep into the flesh, the death toll which the British and French had suffered was far greater than in Bruno's past life. And this was just on the Western Front, with the Empire of Japan being wielded against British and French colonies in the Pacific, opening a far larger Pacific theater in this war, and German domination of the seas allowing for routine shipments of weapons and munitions to their colonial possessions. One might say that the Allied powers had suffered monumental casualties that were perhaps 2-3x their scale in the previous war. Meanwhile, the Central Powers had suffered a fraction of their overall casualties, especially when you considered they came from the 3 nations with the highest rates during the previous timeline. It was a once-sided affair, as any war of such scale could possibly be. The majority of the world's nations were at war with one another, and one side was clearly winning in dominant fashion. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled, the Kingdom of Serbia was absorbed, however temporarily, into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Bulgaria capitulated in a matter of days, and Italy surrendered at the first sign of German aggression. The British Empire had dissolved its parliament and begun the process of total surrender. All that remained was France, and their army was already destitute, weary, and broken. Their will to fight no longer existed, and even the threats of the officers in command had little effect on the soldiers of the French army, many of which chose to get drunk while in the trenches rather than maintain watch over their position. At any point, if Germany really wanted to, they could break through critical areas of the front lines with only the slightest resistance, and yet nobody within the French chain of command, save for perhaps de Gaulle, realized how bad the situation they were in. The leadership of the French army and the Republic as a whole had been driven beyond the point of insanity with their incessant need to avenge past losses and current defeats. The sunk cost fallacy gripped their minds and hearts like a cage of thorns. The slightest deviation from it would puncture them, and no doubt end with a miserable end. An apt analogy when one considered the moment the French army surrendered, the Republic was doomed to the same fate as its predecessors. The people would riot and revolt. Such sentiment was barely being curtailed with the French government's massive attempts to sway the masses via propaganda and false hope. Every newspaper had become a mouthpiece of the state, who printed some variation of the same headline every day. Victory is certain. Germany can only hold on for so long. Ypres was not of strategic importance. Wilhelm won't be in power for long. We are winning. While Bruno was laughing with a cup of coffee in his hands while peacefully enjoying his leave in Berlin, along with the rest of the German soldiers who had fought in the Balkans, Caucasus, and Italy, the top French officials were in a heated discussion about how they planned to proceed as a result of the British Empire declaring a state of armistice with the Central Powers. One French minister was particularly furious as he violently threw an object from his desk at a wall, while cursing at the reports in his hands. We've been stabbed in the back by our allies. Twice. First, those damned Italian pigs waved the white flag at the first given opportunity and surrendered to the Germans without giving us the slightest warning. How many of our men died in the Alps to protect their territory, and yet the moment they faltered, they simply laid down their arms and submitted to the enemy. Cowards. All of them. And the damned British are no better. I should have known they would give up the moment the war became too much for them to handle. It would not be the first time they did such a thing to their allies. The other ministers had varied expressions on their faces. Some were as enraged as the man currently shouting, while others were pale, as if they felt sick to their stomach while thinking about what was about to happen to all of them. Guillotines would likely make a comeback after the disaster they had led France into. But these men, with some semblance of common sense, were the minority, as the majority of France's leadership was among the irate, and their solution to their current crisis? Double, triple, and quadruple down. As a result, it was not long before someone shared that exact sentiment. We cannot allow them to get away with this. Blood must be paid for with blood. We will fight until the very end. No matter what. We will not admit defeat, even if they march through the streets of Paris itself and storm Versailles as they did in 71. France will never be defeated a second time. Nearly the entire crowd shouted their support, causing those minorities of politicians with dissenting views to silently converse with themselves in the back about their plans to escape the chaos that was to come. I don't know about you guys, but I'm going to take my family to our summer estate in Algeria for a much-needed and extended vacation. I hear it has remained relatively unscathed from all of this nonsense, and I do not want my head to roll like the rest of these fools. Thus, France had made its bed and intended to lay in it. What few French politicians, generals, admirals, and ministers that had any semblance of common sense decided to also visit the colonies for an undetermined amount of time. As for the rest of the nation, they would only submit after they had been thoroughly crushed by the German army, which was already preparing for its final offensive, one that was designed to end the war once and for all. Chapter 353. Discussion: The Invasion Plan Part 1. France was committed to war. It was not hard to understand why that was the case. Millions were dead, more injured, and not a single inch of the soil they swore to regain having been gained under their possession despite the immense cost paid. All for a war that started over a dispute between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A dispute that was now concluded. Naturally, there were those aware of this reality, and were riled up on the home front, demanding an end to a war that had cost far, far too much for France. Humanity was far from a logical or rational species. Emotions ruled most people, and fallacious reasoning could be quite convincing to people who were already riled up. The sunken cost fallacy was the idea that one had already spent so much in terms of value, whether monetary or in this case lives, that if they could not stop, and would have to keep going until they recouped some, if not all, of their losses. For France, the nation's leaders seem almost possessed by the idea that they needed something, anything to show for the millions of their young men they had sent to die against the German fortifications. Despite all of their allies having the wisdom to bail out, now that they knew defeat was certain, France remained defiant. The only problem with this was their soldiers were so battered and beaten by what they had endured thus far that there was a very high probability of mutiny, defection, or outright surrender the moment they made contact with the enemy. But that was none of Bruno's concern for now. In fact, the man was invited back over to the Kaiser's estate, not only for himself, but his wife and children as well. This was an opportunity for Eva to meet with her future husband under the supervision of their mothers. As for Heidi's opinions on the betrothal that Bruno made, she was actually quite relieved. She was after all personally friends with the boy's mother, as the two of them were members of the same order of dames, and she was aware of his character as a result. But more than that, Heidi also saw this as Eva's opportunity to become the future Kaiserin, an honor she never thought would be possible for any of her children as a result of her own personal muddied heritage. Sure, the betrothal had yet to be officially announced, but the necessary parties were already in the know of what had been established. As for Bruno, he actually was enjoying drinks with the Kaiser, and a rather unexpected face. The Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, who was currently living in exile within the safety of the German Reich after the disaster that was Hindenburg's folly, as it was now commonly referred to as, Marie Adelaide, was already slightly intoxicated as she had a poor constitution for alcohol by nature and was quite nervous by the nature of the invitation. Her face was slightly flushed as she spoke with Bruno so openly about her disdain for his peer, who had fumbled the bag, so to speak, when it came to the defense of her nation, that even Bruno detected a hint of luster in her eyes towards him. That damn old fool cost me my country. But you don't seem to be old enough to be senile like him. In fact, you're far younger and more handsome than I expected you to be. What are you, 25? No, 26? My God, you're roughly my age. How did a young and strapping young man like you manage to climb your way to the top of the army? Bruno rolled his eyes and grabbed the woman's drink, which she was nearly spilling on his suit as she leaned way too close to him. He then put it on the table and assured her he was not interested in her advances in the slightest, despite her natural beauty. Your Grace, far be it from me to question you, but it would appear you have had too much to drink. If your vision is failing you to such an extent that you truly believe I am roughly the same age as you, then I believe it is time for you to cease with the festivities and instead drink some coffee to sober up. Wilhelm was trying his best not to laugh, primarily because he was well aware that Bruno looked much younger than his actual age, and that from the woman's perspective it would appear that he was trying to gaslight her into thinking she was drunker than she really was. And without a doubt, she was quick to take the bait, as she posed a question she was not expecting in the slightest. Oh yeah? I will admit I have had too much to drink if you are really older than I guessed. The Kaiser here can act as witness and verify your claims, as I have heard he has known you since you were quite young. How old are you, Prince von Zehntner? Bruno's expression was cold as ice as he said the precise number without the slightest hesitation. I will be 37 in December. Isn't that right, Wilhelm? And you, madam, have had far too much to drink. So please, sober up as we have far more important conversations to talk about than my age. Quite frankly, the woman could not believe her ears and was quick to turn around to verify with Kaiser Wilhelm II of whether or not these claims were true. And the man did so with his best attempt to conceal his conceit. After seeing the Kaiser's nod of confirmation, the Grand Duchess looked back between the two, suddenly believing she had indeed consumed far more alcohol than was reasonably possible, as she was quick to admit defeat. You know what? I think it would be best if I lied down for a few moments. Please do pardon my behavior. After she wandered off, the Kaiser broke out into laughter, punching Bruno in the shoulder playfully as he did so. You rascal. You know damn well she wasn't that drunk. Must you really bully the poor girl? Bruno smirked as he responded to the Kaiser's comments with a bit of a proud tone in his voice. Hey, if you want a woman to stop flirting with you, just remind her that you're old enough to be her father. And if she's into that kind of thing, then run away because whatever she may offer you is not worth it. This caused the Kaiser to continue to chuckle as he drank from his beer stein, before speaking to Bruno that there was an alternative to his solution he did not think through. And what if she's interested in you not because you are the same age as her father, but because you are the personification of the fountain of youth itself? When Bruno heard this, he simply drank from his own liter of beer before returning the Kaiser's witty remark with a blunt one. Well, now I hadn't thought of that. Chapter 354. Discussing the Invasion Plan Part 2. Once the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg was gone, and Bruno was alone with the Kaiser, the man was quick to bring up the offensive that would lead to a swift and brutal end to the war. I didn't want to discuss this in front of a maiden, so it's good that she has finally departed, but her territory will become the front from which the Eighth Army makes its initial advance. Other forces in Ypres and Alsace-Lothringen will push at the same time, while the Italians have agreed to grant military access so that we can invade France from the south as well. To put it simply, there will be no escape for the French army once the onslaught has begun, and I need you to be okay with that. The Kaiser's expression went from playful to somber as he was quick to ask the question Bruno was expecting him to. You have promised the war ended by the time the new year comes, and have even promised to act with decreased caution and increased aggression to achieve this. May I ask how many of our men must die for this to be accomplished? Bruno did not hesitate to respond as he followed up with his reasoning immediately after. 500,000 at the most will be killed or wounded in action. This, of course, includes the figures of our allies. The French have resolved themselves to fight until the bitter end, and theoretically the moment they realize they are encircled and there is no escape, the idea of surrender will no longer become an option. Should we have found ourselves in a normal war of identical scale, but where all forces are relatively equal in size, our losses would be considerably higher in order to obtain our objectives. But not only is the Eighth Army fully mechanized, we also have another army that should be set up to mirror its capabilities. In addition to this, our allies have begun to produce their own tanks en masse, and while they are lagging behind in the department of other armored vehicles, we should expect hundreds if not thousands of their own tanks by the time the offensive begins in September. The number of armored vehicles which are not only vastly superior to what our enemies are fielding, but in many ways allow the deployment of troops with protection from hostile fire will severely mitigate casualties. Even so, most of our army is still underprepared, and our industry is not yet at the scale where we can completely modernize all of our troops before this war comes to an end. So judging by the maximum level of resistance France is capable of providing, I'd say that those figures sound about right. Or France could give up without a fight and wave the white flag the moment they come across our troops. It's hard to say, really. The Kaiser was not at all surprised by the figure espoused, but he was hopeful that things would not end so poorly, considering it was the final push of the war. All he said to Bruno was something that Bruno was not expecting him to say at all. Do whatever needs to be done to win the war as swiftly as possible. When Bruno heard this, his head turned over to look at the Kaiser with a serious gaze, alerting to the man of the potential folly he may have just made with his very poor choice of words. My Kaiser, you need to understand that those words could act as a just cause for me to go off the reservation, so to speak, with the methods I choose to use in order to end the war as soon as possible. There are means at my disposal I have been reluctant to use due to the, shall we say, immoral nature of their use on a battlefield. But most certainly I could do so, and they would certainly expedite the process of victory while minimizing our casualties. But I fear the cost of life for the enemy would be overwhelming. The Kaiser looked at Bruno as if he was about to pose something so sinister that even the devil would blush at the suggestions made. And because of that, there was a hint of horror in his tone as he realized what he had almost unleashed on the French Republic. Do I even want to know what an ungodly abomination you have devised behind my back? Oh, who am I kidding? I'm sure I will come to regret this if I do not ask in advance. What precisely are you referring to, Bruno? Bruno felt like he was being unnecessarily judged, and because of this he was quick to assure the Kaiser that this was all in theory and nothing was solidified until he clarified his stance on the matter. Theoretically, if I were to have secretly prepared a stockpile of munitions, designed for the purpose of a worst-case scenario, to completely obliterate the enemy army without a chance to surrender, shells that could hypothetically be loaded into our 10 centimeters, 15 centimeters, 17 centimeters, and 21 centimeters field guns without any need for modification. And these shells, if they were to exist, would detonate and launch a bunch of small spherical incendiary bombs in all directions at an optimal altitude for maximum coverage. Think of it like a shell filled with a cluster of smaller explosives, if you will. These shells would, if they existed, be filled with the same devious invention I put in our flamethrowers. You know, napalm. Meaning that any attempt for the men to try to pat out the flames would result in it spreading. Again, this is all entirely theoretical. But should they exist, and in significant capacity, I mean the war would be over in weeks, because there would not be left in terms of French soldiers or fortifications to stand in our way should they be deployed. The Kaiser looked absolutely mortified at what Bruno had said, as he was all too aware of the effects napalm had on a battlefield, and was quick to ask the question that immediately became most pertinent to him after hearing the potential existence of such a thing. And just how many of these shells would you currently have stockpiled, hypothetically speaking? Bruno could tell how the Kaiser was feeling right now, and deliberately underestimated how many he had in an attempt not to make himself look like a monster. I mean, if such a stockpile did exist, and I'm not saying it does, I would have to take a look at the numbers, but I would say probably enough for a single month's use. So, 8 million, give or take. The moment the Kaiser heard this overwhelming number, he felt like he was going to have a heart attack, and after quickly regaining some clarity of mind, he swiftly chastised Bruno for his recklessness. Good God, man, will you not be satisfied unless you turn the entirety of the earth into a hellish reality? No, no. I will not permit the use of such weapons against our enemies, especially because they may try to copy them and use them against us in the future. If such a thing does exist, it should only be used in defense of the fatherland, and the hypothetical situation where we are overrun and have no other means of defending ourselves against the invaders. So, you understand what I am saying, right? Bruno understood loud and clear. The use of cluster munitions, especially those of a napalm variety, was not being permitted, and that he was only allowed to use them if the entire war turned a 180, and Germany was somehow facing a situation like they were in 1945. Very well, sir. I will proceed as previously discussed, noting that the use of such theoretical weapons is prohibited under the current circumstances. With this, the Kaiser might have very well prevented Bruno from using the entirety of the French army as a test subject for his cluster munitions. If only the Kaiser realized Bruno would soon be approving the testing of a far more terrifying explosive weapon, one that, if turned into cluster munitions, would strike fear into the hearts of any enemy the Reich may ever face on the field of battle. Chapter 355, BF 109s, Do 17s, and Ju 52s. Without the approval of the use of his cluster munitions, as Bruno had expected the Kaiser to do, this meant that the final push into France would consist of more conventional weapons, something Bruno found to be distasteful. But to be fair, the current cluster munition stockpile would only last about a month at the current rate of Germany's shell usage, which by now had reached its zenith, being comparable to what Germany was using in the final year of the war during his past life. They were better off suited as a weapon to be deployed in the off-chance Germany screwed up so badly that they found themselves in a scenario where their borders were being overrun by the enemy. A secret weapon, if you will, or a reverse Uno card, as Bruno liked to call it. As a result, after discussing the matter with the Kaiser at length, Bruno and his family would retire to their estate for the day, where the man began drafting plans for next-generation aircraft, which he hoped would begin seeing service in the German armed forces at the start of the coming decade. Bruno was already making preparations for the start of the Second World War. As though he hoped the victory obtained soon would prevent its outcome, he suspected it would happen, regardless. But if these weapons were discovered before the war began, it would inspire his rivals on the global stage to try to catch up as quickly as they feasibly could. As a result, Bruno had several of what he referred to as decoy projects. This was a generation of equipment in between what he intended Germany to field when the Second World War finally reared its ugly head. weapons that could prove reasonably useful during the interwar period leading up to it, as both a decoy, if built in sufficient numbers, to distract rival intelligence agencies, as well as in foreign aid to potential allies. Because of this, as Bruno looked at the development of the aircraft, he decided to use aircraft that were also initially developed during the interwar period of his past life as inspiration. Whether it was Bf-109 fighters, which depending on the model could perform a variety of roles, or the Dornier Do-17 light bomber, which, while vastly superior to the He-51 bombing variants which Germany currently used to limited effect, were still lacking in range and power. In fact, as Bruno thought about it, his use of the He-51 primarily as a fighter, reconnaissance, and close air support plane had actually changed the outcome of arms development. He did not have a functional heavy bomber, or even a medium bomber for more serious bombing raids, instead choosing to use artillery over air power in that regard during the war. And, because the war was ending so soon, nobody had really developed a heavy bomber as they were too busy trying to shoot German planes out of the sky, and failing in that regard. The war would be ending halfway through, and those who wanted to know how best to prepare for the next war would naturally look towards what had proven effective in this war, as was common thought for nation-states, and how they tried to prepare for future conflicts. Few leaders actually had the forethought and vision on how a future war would be waged. Thus, the Allies would look at submarines, fighter aircraft that could also operate as close air support, and armored vehicles when developing weapons for the future. Bruno had fully neglected bombers as a primary part of his air power, and because of this, he was really the only one who understood how capable they would be in the future wars to come. Thus, if Germany developed multi-role fighters and light bombers during the interwar period, few would be enough of a visionary to think of developing larger-scale bombers. Hence why Bruno went with the Do-17. At the same time, there was really one additional form of aircraft Bruno needed to develop, and that was the transport aircraft. Whether for transporting supplies or men, aircraft would play a leading role in future logistic networks. With or without Bruno's interference, this would be discovered in the coming decades. So he might as well begin the process of developing a proper interwar era to transport aircraft for military applications. As a result, Bruno chose the Junkers Ju-52 as his interwar era transport plane. With these three planes, Germany could manufacture a sufficient amount to not only act as a cover for what they were really planning for the near future, but also they were capable enough to provide support to more frontline forces, or even act as a strategic reserve should such a thing become completely necessary. But when it came to what Bruno actually had planned for the future to accompany his E-10 and E-25 series equipped with combined arms battalions, well, these would be a matter of further development as the time eventually came for Bruno to put down the pen and rest for the night. After all, his blueprints were more proofs of concept, along with a list of requirements he wanted from the men he employed as full-time engineers. The actual development and function of the weapons would come down to the same men who made them a possibility in his past life, or at the very least their forebearers from the generation prior. Either way, he did not intend to spend his entire leave developing weapons that were not needed until 20 years after his victory was gained. Instead, Bruno turned off the light in his office with the current designs securely stashed away in his safe, before returning to his bedroom, where he climbed into bed next to his wife, who reacted warmly to his entry by turning around and hugging him, seemingly peacefully at sleep as she did so. After kissing the woman on the forehead and wishing her good night, Bruno closed his eyes and dreamed of the life he hoped to create for the future of his children and their children. Chapter 356, A Man of the People. Heidi was happier than she had been in a long time, and the reason for this was quite simple. Her family was home, together for the first time in a very, very long time. Not only was Bruno home from the war for several months of leave, but Erwin was granted leave from the academy as well. He was granted permission to attend this important family function which the von Zehntner household put on every year at the main estate. Because of this, Heidi was able to walk into the villa's grounds while holding on to her beloved husband's arm, which was miraculously still attached to his body, despite the dangers he regularly and needlessly put himself in. The von Zehntners were a family of wealthy war industrialists who now had deep ties to the political class. They were also noblemen who had been granted a much higher rank as a result of their relation to Bruno, who was, in the Kaiser's own words, the most exceptionally gifted military leader the German nation had ever been blessed with. While Bruno was certainly talented in the fields of logistics, tactics, and strategy, it was not without mentioning, at least within his own mind, that many of his achievements came because he had an understanding of the future of warfare and of how it should be properly waged. Nevertheless, to the people of this era, he was a visionary beyond anyone that had preceded. Minor and great powers alike dreaded the idea of his very existence, and at the same time, envied Germany for having someone like him. It wasn't just Bruno's capabilities on the battlefield as a brilliant commander. Unlike many of his predecessors such as Napoleon, he was the whole package, an attractive and charismatic man who was on par with the sculptures the ancient Greeks left behind of their gods, while also possessing a mind for engineering and science. On top of this, Bruno was a titan of industry and a philanthropist. Everything about him made lesser men envious, but what drove them mad was he seemed to be quite pious. Intelligence agents had driven themselves to the point of despair, looking for the slightest dirt on Bruno. Addiction? Debauchery? Infidelity? For fuck's sake, blasphemy. There was nothing on him that could be unsurfaced, which did not merely add to his aura. A man of God who, despite his vast wealth, actually tithed to the church. A man who, despite his valor, good looks and charm, was faithful and loving to his wife. Who raised his children properly and abstained from excessive intakes of alcohol. How could such an ideal of a man exist? If there was one flaw with Bruno, it was his lack of overall remorse towards those souls he had sent to the afterlife. Either way, the man had risen to the top of society and was now the embodiment of near mythical figures. Because of this, even those brothers who had once envied him and despised him for his gifts were now rustling his hair and clinking their mugs of beer together with the man for all that he had accomplished in the year since their last meeting. And they did this the moment he entered the grounds of the family estate, damn near trying to pick him up on their shoulders, and would have indeed done so if he hadn't so violently refused the attempt. Oh, come on, Bruno. We're here to celebrate. Another year, and despite all the chaos going in the world, we are all still here in one piece. And you, little brother, my God, you beautiful bastard. Do you have any idea what your reputation is among the working class? As a member of the Bundeswehr representing the Kingdom of Prussia and the German Conservative Party, Ludwig was seldom this informal, even among his own family and close friends. But Bruno's image had done wonders for the party their family most closely supported. It was a party of monarchists, social conservatives, religiously inclined folk, and of course most of all the nobility. But there were other parties which were similar and represented the interests of the working class. Usually they would not be so keen to work with the noblemen above them, but Bruno was the unifying factor of their little coalition of right-wing parties. Insofar as he was 2 generations removed from his family initially gaining nobility and was already a prince, granted in foreign nations, but there were rumors that Bruno would be granted a similar if not greater status here in the Reich once the war was over. And as far as the working class was concerned, Bruno was what they aspired their grandchildren to be. It didn't help that Bruno paid his workers extraordinarily well and rewarded their labor and loyalty in every way he could that didn't draw away from the overall function of his corporations and the purposes they served. Because of this, Bruno was actually quite interested in what the common men were saying about him and was quick to raise his brow as he finally responded to Ludwig's overly affectionate gestures. No, I don't have the slightest clue. In case you haven't realized, I've been incredibly busy winning a war. What are the men here in the fatherland saying for me? Ludwig immediately did an impression of one of the men he heard in the streets who was clearly a member of the working class talking about Bruno to his buddies as they appeared to just be getting off work. I don't care how wealthy he is. I heard from my nephew that he personally took over the boy's spot on watch for the night so that the kid could get some proper rest. As far as I'm concerned, that is one noble bastard. I would more than willingly buy a drink should I ever get the chance to meet him. I might even shake his hand. This exaggerated impression caused all of Bruno's brother to break out into laughter together as they almost in unison said the same thing aloud. A true man of the people. Bruno was quite honestly shocked that the average working man thought of him this way. And if he knew how much he was celebrated in the German Reich by people of all walks of life. Except for perhaps the oldest and most proud of noble houses, he would realize that he indeed was the definition of a man of the people. Chapter 357. The Prodigal Son Returns. Bruno's warm welcome by his 8 older brothers was met with the attitude you would not expect from a man nicknamed the Butcher of Belgrade and the Red Scourge. In fact, as he shoved his older brothers away, preventing them from lifting him into the air, as if this was some kind of concert, there was almost a hint of playfulness in his tone, as well as something else entirely. In his youth, Bruno was isolated from his siblings. Having been born with exceptional intelligence and wisdom beyond his years, his early displays of intellect had garnered jealous behavior from his older siblings. In addition to this, he was the youngest of 9 brothers, making him a natural target to be picked upon. His mother's overly affectionate nature towards him, which far exceeded what she showed his other siblings, most certainly did not help in this regard. But adolescent feelings of petty jealousy and the foolishness of youth did not last forever. And as the years passed, Bruno found himself growing closer to his brothers. However, of his 8 brothers, one of them was not partaking in the festivities. In fact, in an unusual display of character, the man was acting rather timidly while standing in the corner with his own family. This was the first year that he was welcomed back with open arms by those who had cast him aside. And when Bruno noticed this, he was quick to cease his brother's celebration of the accomplishments he had made that had elevated their family to the highest of heights within the German Reich, and instead point out that someone was missing among their ranks as he cast a gaze over to the man in question. "All right, you fuckers, calm down. It's not like I'm the only one who has aided this family these past few years." As a matter of fact, Bruno went silent and emphasized with his expression who he was staring at. Maximilian and his children seemed as if they were wild hares surrounded by a pack of ravenous wolves. And as the alpha of the pack approached them, they damn near lost the strength in their legs. For Maximilian, who had wronged Bruno personally in more ways than he could ever forgive himself for, this was the moment he dreaded most. Only through sheer strength of will did he resist the urge to shamefully collapse. The man closed his eyes, expecting Bruno would slap him across the face for the foolishness he had done to get himself so thoroughly expunged from the family to begin with. But Maximilian was surprised to find that Bruno did not strike him, but rather instead embraced him with a brotherly hug before releasing the man and letting him know that he had more than redeemed himself with a simple phrase. "Welcome home, brother." Maximilian had to fight the urge to break out into tears as he gazed upon Bruno's approving smile and those of his brothers. They didn't chastise him for his errant ways, nor did they bring up the sins of the past. No, it was a look of pride in their eyes. The prodigal son had finally come home, and he was welcomed by his brothers as if he had never left. It was such a touching moment for Maximilian, who had truly had a change of heart and character as a result of the natural consequences he had faced for his bratty behavior, that he could not help but ask why. "I don't understand. I have been exiled for years. I have wronged you in so many ways, and acted as an entitled sponge, soiling the reputation of our family and everyone in it. I was certain that even though Father had invited me home this year, you would all let me have it. Why haven't you?" Bruno shook his head towards his older brother and patted him on his shoulder, assuring him that all was well between them. "I was never all that angry with you, Max. In fact, I am certain Father would say the same. We were just incredibly upset that you had failed to live up to your potential and became an entitled wastrel. You have faced the consequences of your actions, admitted you were wrong, and in doing so worked hard to redeem yourself. That is more than most people would ever have aspired to do. What further could we possibly ask of you?" There were no words for Maximilian to say as he was surrounded by his brothers, and his own children were approached by their cousins and aunts. The errant son, the black sheep of the family, had come home at last, and he was welcomed warmly by those who were waiting for his return. In the past, perhaps because he had felt out of place within the family, Bruno had dreaded these gatherings. But today he could successfully say that this was a joyous occasion. To break bread with his father, mother, and brothers. To celebrate their continued health and longevity as a family, and to exchange tales of what they had been up to the past year, whether on the front of business, politics, or military matters. For the first time, Bruno finally began to understand that it wasn't just him and Heidi against the world, but he had an entire clan to rely upon. In a way, it was perhaps Bruno who had changed the most over these past few years, if not in far more subtle ways than his brother Maximilian, as the idea of family had expanded well beyond its initial scope. An understanding that the concept of the nuclear family was a failed product of the post-war era. Rather, the extended family, as had been practiced by the majority of human cultures and civilizations prior to the end of the Great War, that was the true meaning of family. And from now on, Bruno intended to incorporate the talents, needs, and desires of his house as a whole into his future plans. Chapter 358: Preparations for the Autumn Offensive. The Great War had taken its toll in ways that were virtually inconceivable when compared with prior military conflicts. Millions of dead soldiers were a rarity in warfare, with only a few conflicts prior to the Great War having such a staggering cost of human life. Humanity was a two-sided coin of a creature. On the one hand, human beings had the ability to create some of the most beautiful and inspiring feats imaginable, while on the other hand, they were capable of evils so grand that even the devil would think twice before stepping foot into the mortal domain. And the conditions of the Great War, whether in this life or Bruno's past life, were what he would consider to be the closest thing to hell mankind has ever made here on Earth. Though the Germans suffered less, as a result of them not actively pushing back against Allied hostility on the Western Front, the reality was that the trenches were an apocalyptic scene, especially no man's land. The amount of mines that had been buried before the war had mostly been detonated by Allied forces, and those that remained within no man's land could be triggered at any moment. Because of this, Germany had begun to prepare for its advance into France by spending the time clearing these mines, whether anti-personnel or anti-tank, that still lie waiting for an unfortunate soul to trigger them. These mines were cleared by E-10 tanks that were modified with a mine flail. Considering these vehicles were virtually impervious to anything the Allies could shoot at them, they could operate with alternating shifts day and night clearing mines while the German army prepared for its major offensive without fear of reprisal from the enemy, watching them from the other side of no man's land. Did this give away the fact that Germany planning for a major offensive? Almost certainly. Was France already aware of this FAC? Absolutely. It would be foolish not to expect the Germans to be marching over the wire in the coming months, as they had more or less cleared out every other enemy on the global stage they could currently fight. Charles de Gaulle was a rather exceptional figure from Bruno's past life, or at least as exceptional as a Frenchman in the 20th century could have been. Nevertheless, he was one of the few men who actually had the wherewithal to observe the German advances and innovations that had led to their total victory over the course of the last 2 years. Both on the tactical and strategic level, the Germans really remained undefeated except perhaps with Hindenburg's folly, which had thoroughly disgraced the man in the eyes of the public and the German military. And if the past was anything to go by, he knew exactly who Hindenburg's replacement would be. As a result, he stood in the trenches with a grim expression on his face. In his hand was a half-consumed cigarette, and in his ashtray was at least a whole container worth of such devices, which had already been used up. A French officer was quick to approach the man and hand him an intelligence report. The look on his face was bitter, while he expressed a somber sentiment with an equally fitting tone. Well, it looks like you were right after all. Our intelligence, or what little we have, suggests the 8th Army is making its way to the front. They appear to be making Luxembourg their first target. They will come over the wire like an army of devils, and will have us all thoroughly slaughtered within an hour, maybe 2. Charles de Gaulle remained utterly silent as he kept his cigarette held firmly in his mouth with the pressure of his lips, while flicking through the dossier with his gloves hands. Gloves whose filth mired the very documents he was reading as he examined the information contained within. He is a military mastermind of the highest caliber. He has flawlessly envisioned the future of warfare for the age of industry and has perfected it down to a precise science. What we're looking at here, although I doubt the information is complete, is a thorough understanding of warfare in ways we cannot possibly imagine. French intelligence had been failing since the war began, largely because of the combined arms doctrine of the German armed forces, which integrated aerial and land-based reconnaissance units to coordinate precision strikes on high-value targets, including, of course, enemy recon. That, and Germany's efforts to reform the Kaiser's secret police, and by extension internal security efforts, had made it very difficult to actually pry into the Reich's secrets. Because of this, All the French could confirm was the combat portion of the German battalion tactical group structure, which would be overhauled completely for the upcoming era after this war was over. Because of this, what the French had available to them was an understanding of mechanized warfare, but not proper combined arms doctrine. Deploying mechanized and motorized infantry with armor was a concept the Allies had not thought of and had led to their defeat time and time again. And now that this information could be confirmed, Charles de Gaulle could only shake his head and sigh as he expressed his lament openly to the junior officer beneath his command. It is a pity it took us 2 years to discover this. Perhaps had we known from the start, we would have been able to make adequate counters to this style of warfare for this major offensive. But I fear what few weapons we do have been poorly designed for the threat they were meant to face. The junior officer remained silent. The only sound escaping his mouth was the air releasing from his lungs as he expressed his agreement with the general's assessment without saying a single thing. France was doomed to lose this war. Unfortunately, their superiors in Paris did not agree, and as a result were coming up with all kinds of madness to try to defeat the Germans in the coming months when they finally began their autumn offensive. Chapter 359, A Race Against Time. After celebrating the family reunion with his house, Bruno, Heidi, and their children returned to their own estate, where Bruno was surprised to see several dapper-looking men standing outside his villa's gates waiting for his arrival. Bruno had a likely idea of who these men were based upon the way they were dressed, how they handled themselves, and by the car they were using, which was favored by undercover law enforcement agents of the German Reich. But Heidi, not understanding the situation, was quick to ask for clarification from the guards who were hired to protect Bruno and his family. Who are those 2 men, and why have they not been forced away from our home yet? Bruno was quick to answer the question as he looked back towards today's paper, reading the headline about another series of gruesome murders connected to the shadowy killer who was suspected of murdering them. He then placed the paper down and answered the question with a stern expression on his face before the guards had the opportunity to do so. There is only one reason those men would be permitted to loiter outside the gates of our estate. They are agents of the crown, and I suspect they are here to see me. Do gather the kids, and make sure they get prepared for bed. I will speak to these officers within my study. Heidi naturally glanced at her husband with a look of concern on her face, but his reassuring smile convinced her that all would be well, and because of this, she was quick to do as Bruno said after the car pulled into the driveway. After which, Bruno marched up to his study and placed his coat on his rack, waiting for the villa's guards to lead the officers into the room on his behalf. Despite these men being law enforcement agents working on behalf of the German Reich, Bruno did not pull out the red carpet for them. He did not greet them at his house's entry as if they were respected guests, nor did he prepare refreshments or even proper seating for them. Thus, when the 2 men entered the room, they stood there in front of Bruno, who had a glass of distilled spirits in his hand, as he asked them to get straight to the point. I presume if you were permitted to stand and wait outside my house without being forced away by my bodyguards, then you 2 must be working for the Kingdom of Prussia, correct? Or perhaps the Empire altogether. Go on then, get out with it. You must have been waiting all day to speak with me. Suspecting that Bruno was going to be difficult from the start, the elder of the 2 agents pulled out his badge and showed it to Bruno before handing over a file to him. Detective Abraham Bernstein, and this is my colleague Detective Karl Vogel. We wanted to speak with you about one of the men who is supposedly actively serving beneath your command, one Oberst Erich von Humboldt. He is currently a suspect in our investigations of the serial killer, which the media has labeled the Shadow of Death. We would like to ask you several questions about his current whereabouts, and when you have last personally been a witness to his presence. Bruno quickly narrowed his eyes at the 2 men, especially the elder of the 2. The dossier he handed Bruno was contained full of information on several of the murders he had conducted within the borders of the German Reich, and on Bruno's order no less. Because of this, Bruno was quick to snap at the men for overstepping their bounds. And which department are you 2 gentlemen with, exactly? Because the last time I checked, matters regarding alleged crimes committed by soldiers in service of His Majesty are the jurisdiction of the Feldgendarmerie. And you 2 don't appear to be military police, now do you? Who is your supervisor? Because I would very much like to speak to him about why he has decided to get himself involved with military affairs while a war is being waged. You come to my home without a warrant and sit outside my gates for hours just to come in here and speak to me about matters that are not within your jurisdiction, on whose authority. These men were clearly not related to the Kaiser's secret police, as the names of every field agent involved in the agency, as well as their appearances, were permanently seared into Bruno's brain thanks to Eric's help in establishing the agency. No, these two men were likely from a more local, or even federal law enforcement agency that was under pressure to resolve the case as soon as possible. But if they had come to Bruno, it meant they had enough evidence to name Eric as a suspect, so much so that they didn't mind stepping over the lines of jurisdiction to personally confront Bruno about the matter. Bruno knew damn well they were fishing for a reaction to prove their suspicions were correct, even if it meant a formal reprimand. But he had to play the part to buy Eric time. After all, Eric was close to finishing his list, but there were still several key figures left who needed to die. And if the feds were this close to him, then there was no telling how long it would take them to catch up. As a result, he immediately feigned offense, despite knowing the game that was being played against him. After all, whoever was smart enough to connect the dots to Eric knew damn well he was not the man pulling the strings. And if he was that capable, then it was a very short leap of logic to begin looking into Bruno as the puppet master. Bruno had suspected this was a likely outcome and had placed a gamble on his actions, which seemed to have had the intended effect, as the men quickly apologized, yet did not divulge which specific department they were attached to, or who had given them permission to act in such an unlawful manner. Instead, they were quick to scurry away from Bruno's home like the rats they were, no doubt waiting for Bruno to pick up his phone and make contact with Eric. After all, wiretapping had been a thing since the 1890s, but gaining access to Bruno's home was difficult. Without a warrant to implement devices to monitor his communications, they would never gain entry to his home. But the state could potentially leverage one of Bruno's staff to betray him, especially if they had some means of blackmail against them. As much as Bruno had treated his staff with all the respect and dignity an employer could feasibly manage over the years, he could never trust someone outside his family not to betray him. Such a move could prove fatal to him and his loved ones if he tried. No, the first number he dialed was not Eric, but rather the commissioner of the local police, demanding an explanation on who the two men were who had showed up at his house, giving over the names they had given them. Naturally, Bruno's suspicions were correct, and the agency that was tackling these murders, which were committed not only across the entirety of the German Reich, but also international borders, were indeed listening to Bruno's calls. They were surprised that he had immediately contacted the local police commissioner to find out who the hell had the gall to step on the German army's authority, with the exact words being, "If I don't get the actual identity of the fucking prick who greenlit this blatant violation of the German army's jurisdiction within the next hour, I will personally dispatch the local Feldgendarmerie and have them drag you out of your fucking headquarters in handcuffs under charges of sedition and treason in an act of subversion against the war effort." Upon hearing the conversation between the police commissioner and Bruno, the agent at the head of the task force to investigate the mass murders of the serial killer being labeled as the Shadow of Death by the media, was quick to make his thoughts on the matter clear. It is highly probable that the killer is, as we suspected, Oberst Erich von Humboldt, who is acting under the orders of General Feldmarschall Bruno von Zehntner. I'm not sure why exactly the Wolf of Prussia would be inclined to green-lit such a killing spree. But if this is truly the case, he has over 300,000 men either actively serving in the German army or veterans of the Russian Civil War who would be willing to die to protect him. He also has friendly ties to the Habsburgs and Romanovs, the latter of which would be more than willing to give him asylum even if we manage to convince the Kaiser to pursue him. If we want any chance to dissuade these men from taking up arms in his defense, then we will need concrete evidence that he ordered the butchering of those innocent men, women, and children. We need to get to Eric and flip that mad dog against his master before it is too late. It is a race against time, gentlemen. The atmosphere was grim, as the agents of the German Imperial Police realized that their worst nightmares were true. A man who was damn near untouchable had likely been the culprit behind the murders of some very powerful people. Powerful people who, despite having largely been wiped out, had left behind traces of influence and power within the institutions of the German Reich. However, these remnants could not actively move against Bruno or his family outside the scope of the law. After all, the memory of Belgrade was fresh within their minds, and the fate of those who even attempted to harm the House von Zehntner or those within their sphere of influence was forever stained upon the history of Serbia. Because of this, the walls were closing in on Eric, and he needed to complete the list of names before it was too late. At the same time, Bruno needed to find a way to contact him without leaving behind any evidence of his involvement. As the agent in charge of the Imperial Police had said, it was truly a race against time. Chapter 360, On the Run. After the men left Bruno's office and were escorted from his home, Heidi appeared in the doorway. She had a concerned look on her face as she was quick to ask Bruno what this matter was all about, seemingly having an inkling about who they were to begin with. Do these men have anything to do with what you have tasked Eric with? Naturally, there were 3 people in this world who knew about Eric's activities while he was absent without leave from the army. The man himself was well aware of what he had done, while Bruno, the man who had given him the task to begin with, was the natural second. As for the third, it was none other than Heidi. Ever since resolving to tell his wife the truth, and nothing but the truth, Bruno concealed nothing to her, no matter how grisly the details may be. Thankfully, she was a woman with a thick skin and a sense of pragmatism when it came to fulfilling one's obligations to family, Kaiser, and fatherland. Though she lamented the loss of the innocent, she understood the price that must be paid to save the German Reich and the souls of all those within it, and the future generations that would come. Thus, Bruno had not hid from her what he had told Eric to do, or what he had done. Bruno nodded his head and voiced his thoughts aloud. While wiretapping may exist, wireless bugs that could be placed in his room and transmit his words elsewhere without his knowledge and consent might as well be science fiction with the current technology of the era. Thus, after confirming that his phone line was indeed not active, he said his honest thoughts on the matter. Those men were with the Imperial Police, but they are not acting within the interests of the Reich. There's a reason law enforcement is generally left up to the local and state-level police departments. No, these men are acting on behalf of the men I am hunting, or what little remains of their population. But it does not matter. Eric will complete the task soon enough, and then when the masters of these bloodhounds have had their throats slit and the evidence of their sins has been leaked to the public, I will personally have these mutts arrested and executed without trial. It is a time of war, and for violating the jurisdiction of the Feldgendarmerie, I will fight for the authority in a court of law for their execution if necessary, after it has been conducted naturally. Any evidence they have on Eric and myself will be gathered and destroyed by men I know and trust before it can reach anyone who is not of such privilege. Heidi's expression lightened as she sighed in relief upon hearing everything was under Bruno's control, and as she turned away to go check on the kids once more, she stopped in the doorway before turning around and facing Bruno. A look of dread has suddenly come over her as she realized something. She was quick to ask Bruno what exactly he planned to do with his pawn now that its usefulness had been used up. And what will happen to Eric? They are looking for him right now, no doubt. If they get his hands on him, do you think your plans will move so smoothly then? Though Bruno's words were reassuring, the tone he spoke them in was grim and conveyed his real intent. I have already planned for the matter accordingly. After conducting his tasks, Eric is to meet me at a safe house that only he and I know the location of, and whose ownership cannot possibly be traced to either of us. You need not worry your pretty head over such matters, love. Go, check on the children. I'm going to have one last drink, and then I will join you in our bed shortly. Heidi wanted to say something about the matter, but ultimately chose not to. Instead, doing as Bruno had said. As she was well aware, the man was facing a difficult decision and had yet to seem certain of how he wished to proceed. Bruno did exactly as he said he would, fetching himself a rare second drink. Gone were the days of his heavy drinking. He would drink a single liter of beer for dinner, and no more unless on special occasions. But this was a special occasion. He and Eric were, after all, going up against powerful people, and when the members of this shadowy cabal started dropping like flies, it was only a matter of time before the enemy would throw all of their resources into finding out who was responsible. You see, Bruno had meddled in the affairs of this loose organization repeatedly. Firstly, by saving the Romanovs and annihilating the Red Army. This had far-reaching consequences and had affected their schemes across the board. starting with the repression that socialist and left-wing parties faced across all of Europe as a result of their newfound unpopularity following the conclusion of the Russian Civil War in this timeline. Then there were the alliances Bruno made, the destruction of the Black Hand, and the investments made into the German army, which allowed them to steamroll their opponents and mitigate casualties. With the repeated victories of the Central Powers and the economic boom Germany gained from the mass production of military equipment, it was very difficult to justify to the common man who cared not for politics so long as he had a beer in his hand and bread in his family's stomachs the idea of overthrowing the current state of affairs. Revolutions seldom happened within a state which met the needs of the people. Rather, they were the direct result of civilization's failure to appease the masses. If one wanted to destroy a nation and its people from within, they would first need to subvert it. And subversion came in 4 stages: demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and normalization. And try as they might, the powers Bruno was working against had failed to even begin the first stage of subversion within the German Reich. This was thanks to the changes he had made to the timeline. They had tried to oppose him economically, militarily, and even with guile and intrigue. But Bruno, having knowledge of the future and the threats he was up against, made ample preparations. Aligning himself with powerful people and embedding men who he had earned their loyalty in places which he could counter the enemy hiding in the shadows. All the while becoming a titan of industry so that he did not rely upon their wealth to sustain himself and his family, while using his wealth to combat their ambitions. He had even managed to combat their attempts to inflate the Reich's currency by making his own bank the largest bank in Prussia. Most of Bruno's adversaries within Europe had been annihilated. The Rothschilds were a memory of the past, their entire line of succession wiped off the face of the earth across all branches. The same could be said for other bankers whose interests were aligned. The leaders of the Kiel Mutiny were disposed of, while men of renown who were aligned with this shadowy cabal had one by one been hunted down and eliminated from the name of lists Erich possessed over the previous months. All that was left were the members of the Spartacist League and their families. Erich had done a good job tracking down the revolutionary socialists who went underground following the unpopularity of their movements across Europe a decade prior, and the actions taken against them, thinning their ranks substantially. But now the law was on his tail, and this agency, despite being the imperial police of the German Reich, was desperately searching for Erich's location. If they could get their hands on him and torture him into confessing who the real mastermind of his coordinated mass murder was, they could finally get Bruno dead to rights. There was just one problem. Bruno and Erich had long since prepared for this eventuality, and because of this Bruno was silently able to tip off Erich about what was happening without ever leaving the slightest trace of doing so. For years, Bruno had flown the flags of the German Reich and the Kingdom of Prussia proudly on a pole within the grounds of his villa, a pole that could be witnessed for miles outside the city limits due to its height if one was using a pair of binoculars. Every night, before going to bed, Bruno would personally take down the flags, so that if the weather were to turn sour while he and his staff were sleeping, then the banners of the fatherland would not be sullied. And while he was deployed to war, he had tasked his servants to do the same. It was an action that had been going on for so long that nobody would care to notice if something slightly different had occurred. The thing is, there was a very specific way which Bruno and his staff would take down the flags at night, a sort of ceremony to honor them. And the staff who did so, Bruno's bodyguards. They would always perform a certain small ceremony when doing so, one which honored the flag to military standards. These bodyguards, who Bruno trusted with the lives of himself and his family with, were veterans of the Iron Division, men who Bruno had personally served with during the years of the Russian Civil War, decorated veterans, and loyal beyond all reason. If Bruno were to demand they march into hell with him to wage war against the devil, they would gladly do so without hesitation. And because of this, they were the few men Bruno could reasonably trust to protect him and his family without suspicion of betrayal. One of these men had been tasked to keep watch every night on the outskirts of Berlin to keep an eye on this ceremony. And tonight he was doing so, and when he saw his brothers in arms come out displaying the cross of the Iron Division before all other distinctions of valor they had received on their uniforms, he knew exactly what that meant. You see, to anyone else, This was an unnoticeable distinction to the way they normally wore their uniforms when performing this daily ceremony. But to one of their own, it was a sign, a clear one, to send a message to their brother who was currently performing the work of their commander. And because of this, the man quickly found the nearest payphone and dialed the number of the hotel where Eric was staying. The message was encoded, but was clear as day to Eric. "The authorities are on to you. Finish the job within a fortnight, and meet where we agreed upon once the task is completed." Eric was cleaning his blade from the daily dose of blood it had been given earlier in the day. He could only sigh after writing down the message that the manager at the desk had given him, something that was completely innocuous to those he did not have the means to decipher it, which was something that only Bruno and Eric possessed. And after doing just that, the man sighed heavily, before pulling out his pack of cigarettes and his flask of whiskey. After opening the flask and drinking its entire contents, Eric lit up the smoke as he opened up the window and gazed upon the moon and stars above. On this night, the moon was at its fullest, and a gentle summer breeze kissed his fair cheeks. Throughout the duration of his smoke, Eric remained utterly silent, before putting out his cigarette and tossing its remains onto the ground outside of the hotel. After doing so, he gazed longingly at the moon, before sighing heavily and shaking his head. He uttered a single phrase in a voice so low that only he could hear the words spoken before closing the window behind him as he turned back to the room. The phrase he said were words that only he would ever know were said. "It would appear, Louise, that I will be unable to fulfill our promise after all. But that's okay. You always deserved better anyway." Chapter 361. End of the line. The beating heart of the woman palpitated with ferocity as she sprinted down the streets of Munich with all the speed her small stature could physically muster. Yet the clacking of the boots behind her maintained a steady and slow pace, almost as if he were walking casually, bumping into random strangers or running into objects as she desperately fled the pursuit within the dead of night. During the thickest summer storm God could throw at the Bavarian capital, Rosa Luxemburg's heart dam near reached its limit. She was the last of her comrades, Marxist conspirators and revolutionary socialists who, in Bruno's past life, had been soundly defeated by the Patriotic Free Corps during the chaos that followed the Great War. In this life, her fellow revolutionaries had been hunted down and slaughtered like rabid dogs by none other than Colonel Erich von Humboldt. They knew not the identity of the man which had pursued them, but nevertheless he came for them in the day, in the night, in the sun, wind, rain, and snow. It did not matter where they ran or where they hid. Like the shadow of death himself, Eric was lurking ever near, biding his time and waiting to claim her for their lives. Despite the panic on her face and the frantic speed with which she sprinted, nobody within Munich seemed to remotely care about the woman's situation. And eventually she found herself trapped exactly where Eric wanted her. She had run straight into an alleyway, which led exactly to nowhere. And when she realized this, the woman cursed out in her native tongue, before turning around to see that Eric, despite the measure pace of his stride, was standing right in front of her. He wore a long, black leather German trench coat, concealing his more formal attire. It was not a military uniform which Eric wore, but a black-fitted three-piece suit beneath his coat whose pocket he reached into as he pulled out a list of names, which was shielded from the torrential downpour of the heavens by the jet-black umbrella he held within his hands. The tone in his voice was callous as he looked at the last name on a long list of those which had been crossed out prior to this moment. And after confirming the woman he was looking at was indeed his target, a sadistic smirk formed on the man's face, along with a devilish glint in his blue eyes. Rosa Luxemburg, found member and one of the current leaders of the Spartacus League. Or should I say former leader? Well, Rosa, you should know by now what the silence on the other end of your radio means. They're all dead. Karl Liebknecht, Clara Zetkin, and all the others of your filthy kind that have sought to ruin the fatherland and its victory in this great war. It has been quite the effort, and has no doubt cost the lives of hundreds, if not thousands of your fellow conspirators. But here and now it ends with you. Do you have any last words? Because now would be the time to speak them. Rosa Luxemburg took a defiant stance, almost as if she were in a scene from the cinemas, preparing her heroic last words that would live in infamy throughout history as a testimony to her resilience and resistance in the face of the death. However, Throughout his speech, Eric had stashed the list of names away and had pulled out his suppressed revolver, and the moment Rosa was about to make her stand, Eric pulled the trigger. The projectile went straight into the woman's head and was quiet enough that with the accompanying crackle of thunder, had managed to conceal his sinful deed. Blood was washed away from the victim's corpse as it hit the ground with a muffled thud, the puddle it crashed into breaking the impact of her fall. After this, Eric took a step forward and examined the corpse, setting his umbrella aside and stashing away his pistol, where he silently withdrew his little book of names and crossed off the final one. After which, he sighed and shook his head, clicking his tongue, as if mocking his most recent kill, all the while stashing his book away once more. "I'm sorry about that," I lied. "I really don't give a damn what a foreigner and a Marxist like you has to say. Nothing that has ever gone through that ugly little head of yours has ever been remotely intelligent. Just like all the rest of the drivel, your kind are constantly spitting. But don't worry, we will meet again in hell soon enough. I just have one last thing to take care of before I join you." Having said this, Eric picked up his umbrella and walked off into the dreary night within the city of Munich, fulfilling the last of his orders now that the list of names he had been given had been fully crossed off. What were the last actions Eric had to take care of following his slaying of Rosa Luxemburg in the streets of Munich? A clean shave, along with a crisp haircut in a classic high and tight style. After this, he had a change of clothes back into his military dress uniform, with all the medals he had been awarded over the years proudly on display. After which the man took a train to Berlin, where he made one brief stop at his favorite restaurant to enjoy a nice meal, and a liter of the lager he enjoyed most in this world. Once these things had been concluded, he took a look at his watch and paid the bill, before placing his cap upon his head and bidding the waitress farewell. There was an unusually large tip granted to the young maiden as Eric walked off and approached the safe house that had been arranged for him, where he was not the least bit surprised to see Bruno standing there alone. The safe house was well beyond the boundaries of the city and was far out in the boonies, so far that nobody would possibly be able to witness the exchange between the two old friends. Bruno looked sternly at Eric and asked one simple question. Depending on the answer, Bruno would choose how to proceed here and now. "Is it done? Have you accomplished what I asked of you without incident?" Eric smiled bitterly as he nodded his head and confirmed the deed was done. Every one of them, every name on the list, along with their families and anyone else who might come for you in the name of revenge sometime in the future, they're all gone as ordered. Bruno sighed heavily when he heard this, reaching into his coat pocket as he pulled out a pack of cigarettes. It had been a long time since he had quit smoking, but today was a day where he would make an exception. Lighting the device, he took a long and heavy drag before exhaling a large plume of smoke. After doing so, he handed the cigarette to Eric, who did the same. All the while the rain poured down on the two of them from above, but neither man seemed to notice nor care. While Eric was smoking, Bruno pulled out his flask, which contained the finest distilled liquor money could buy in this world. He took a sip of his own, before wiping off the lid and handing it over to Eric. Eric, now fueled by nicotine and alcohol, handed the flask back to Bruno after plugging its lid, symboling that he had enough, a sentiment which was parallel to the words which he spoke. "So this is it. Huh. The end of the line." Bruno's expression was complex as he took one last drag on the cigarette, followed by drinking what remained of the liquor. Eric had left just enough behind to calm the man's nerves so that he could do what needed to be done. Yet, despite knowing what he needed to do, Bruno wanted more than anything not to do it. Because of this, he was quick to plead with Eric, proposing a solution both of them had no faith in succeeding. "Eric, it doesn't have to be like this. I can get you out of the country, you can flee abroad, start a new life under a new name. Don't make me do this." Eric did not immediately respond to Bruno's pleas, instead looking off at the beauty of the summer landscape of Prussia, while the dew of life rejuvenated all the natural scenery around him. He then turned back to Bruno and asked him directly the question he had been dying to know. "Those people you had me butcher, would they have undone everything you have worked so hard to achieve in this life, if left alone?" There was not the slightest hesitation on Bruno's face or in his words when he responded to his friend's comments with a nod of his head and a severe gaze in his eyes. Without a doubt. Upon hearing this, Eric smiled in relief. as if the one thing haunting him was that after all of this, he had been sent on a wild goose chase with little meaning. There wasn't a hint of bitterness in his eyes. Rather, pride was on full display as he said his last words, words Bruno would never forget. Then I have played my part. I will not be crossing the border or starting a new life. You and I both know after the people I have killed there will be a nationwide investigation once the war is over and priority turns to internal matters. Some of those people were very powerful and influential figures. And even if you manage to burn all the evidence that ties you to me, there will always be a black mark on your reputation and that of your family. The alliances you have built, the monarchs who fight for your favor, all of that will turn to ash and dust as your name becomes forever shrouded in suspicion. No, this is how it should be. Frankly speaking, I would have enjoyed to take part in the last charge to Paris with you and Heinrich, but I am not built for the era of peace that will follow that. Tell that holier-than-thou piece of shit that in the end, he was right about me. Now, how would you like it done? Bruno had to fight back the tears pouring in his eyes, as it took him a second to compose himself enough to respond to Eric's question. In the shoulder, hit the soft tissue above the heart and the aorta. Make it look like you tried to kill me, but in your haste, as I tried to reach for my own weapon, you missed your mark. Eric nodded his head as he reached for his revolver and precisely fired a shot directly into Bruno's flesh, exactly as how Bruno had described, giving him a minor wound that was far more heinous looking than it was in terms of lethality. One of the major reasons Eric had used a Nagant revolver throughout his series of murders was not only because it was quiet when suppressed, but because it was incredibly anemic compared to more modern service cartridges. Knowing that eventually this day would come, he had prepared a bullet that if pierced through the right spot would not be life-threatening in the slightest, nor cause a life-lasting injury. As such, Bruno winced in agony as he clutched the wound in his shoulder with his hand. The man tried his best not to curse or scream in suffering as he turned around to face Eric, who had struck a salute in front of his commanding officer. One last sign of respect to the man who had carried him this far into his career and repeatedly covered for his moral failings and dishonorable conduct on and off the battlefield. Eric's eyes were without fear as Bruno pointed his own weapon at the man's head, who spoke his last words with a triumphant shout. I give my life for Kaiser, Reich und Vaterland. Bang! The smoke jutted out from the muzzle of the barrel as Bruno slowly lowered the gun before holstering it. Performing the sign of the cross, Bruno made a silent prayer for Eric's recently departed soul, as well as his own, before leaning down to close the eyes of his oldest friend. You have served your country well, soldier. Now rest. God knows you have earned it. After saying this, Bruno called in the attack on his life from none other than Eric, thoroughly connecting the murders to his name and his alone, and in doing so officially blemishing the record of his service. It would take decades before anyone began to put together the evidence and come to the conclusion that together Bruno and Eric had saved Germany from a formal conspiracy designed to make the Reich lose the war. But until then, Bruno would have to live with the guilt of dragging one of his closest friends' name through the mud in order to save his own reputation and that of his family. Few would know of the truth of what had happened here on this day, and yet they were not publicly allowed to mourn the loss of a friend and hero of the German Reich, one who was simply not suited for the era of peace and prosperity Bruno was trying to establish. Chapter 362, Flawless Coup. Eric's death hit Bruno hard, harder than he reasonably wanted to admit. But everything that had occurred had been plotted perfectly from the moment he tasked his most loyal and beloved of friends to begin this fateful endeavor. Even though he had a hard time accepting the natural consequences as he stared them in the face, Bruno acted swiftly to secure his position. From the moment Eric was killed, he called in the attack and had the man's body secured. The event acted as a catalyst, a domino effect if you will. It was the signal for the preparations which Bruno had long since made to begin going into effect. The Feldgendarmerie, under his authority, immediately moved into surrounding the federal police in their headquarters, in their field offices, in their homes, and anywhere else they may be found. A purge had begun, and the imperial police found themselves on the losing end of their gamble. Any who had even attempted to flee the country following the deaths of their last backers were already eliminated in silence by Bruno's many other agents hiding in the shadows. As for Bruno, his wound was quickly treated, where he was eventually released from the hospital and allowed to return home, waiting for the signal to be given that all had been concluded in accordance with his scheme. The imperial police were most certainly shocked to find themselves besieged and given orders by the German military police, even more so when, despite being given a verbal chance to surrender, their locations were immediately stormed by the men outside. Bruno, not wanting any evidence to remain of what he had done, quickly dispatched the most loyal of Feldgendarmerie to eliminate the imperial police and its members under a litany of severe charges, including but not limited to high treason, espionage, unlawful coercion, obstruction of military justice, and abuse of authority. You see, as a general feldmarshal during a time of war, Bruno's authority was second only to the Kaiser. He could effectively wield the Reich's military police as a weapon against military or civilian targets, depending on whether or not their crimes were deemed a threat to the war effort. From the moment Bruno put this plot into action, he accounted for the fact that German law enforcement agencies could potentially be bought and paid for by his enemies and used against him. Ironically enough, the police entering Bruno's home without a warrant, yet coercing their way inside by intimidating his staff, as well springing an interrogation on Bruno within his own office over shared drinks, were the actions that gave Bruno full authority to mobilize the Feldgendarmerie. And all of their sins were quickly uncovered. Thus, while threatening the weakest members of Bruno's staff into applying a wiretap and stalking him while he was in Berlin had been seen by the agents of the federal police as their silver bullets. They were, in actuality, the trap that Bruno had prepared for them all along. Even they didn't realize that the staff member had bugged Bruno's phone under his own permission and only after receiving it. Bruno had, after all, carefully vetted everyone near his family, and their loyalty was without question. All along the federal police, the moment they revealed themselves as the agents of the Reich's enemies hidden in the shadows, had been playing into Bruno's hands. And because of this, they now found their headquarters being stormed, and their employees being gunned down under the guise of armed rebellion. After all, the evidence Bruno had compiled classified them as enemy combatants, since they were officially operating under the orders of the Rothschilds and other foreign interests Bruno had since eliminated, making any perceived attempt to resist arrest during a time of war an act of armed rebellion. Thus, there was not even a need for an attempt to arrest the men, as the Feldgendarmerie, whose leadership was largely composed of veterans of the Iron Division, would declare their actions under such circumstances. Because of this, any evidence that existed of Bruno's supposed connections to Erich and the murders of German citizens were immediately shredded and burned by the Feldgendarmerie, while new evidence was quickly forged to tie the imperial police to Erich. Officially, the story became that Erich had been threatened and coerced into operating on behalf of the imperial police to assassinate members of the German military, as well as prominent figures in German society such as politicians, bankers, industrialists, etc. Yes, all the people Bruno had killed that were German and Austro-Hungarian citizens were officially said to have been done by the imperial police, who used Erich as their blade. All the while, the murders Erich had committed in France, Britain, and the USA were left untethered to him. And with Bruno's partial ownership of the press, this propaganda became the official story following the chaos that briefly unfolded as a result of this coup. As a result, Bruno sat in his office, pouring 2 drinks. One for himself, which he was quick to down as humanly possible, but the other remained seated across from him, completely undisturbed. He simply stared at the amber liquid with a bittersweet expression on his face. Eventually, after multiple drinks, Bruno finally said the words he was thinking about with such a solemn gaze. "We did it, old friend. We won the war. Victory is all but guaranteed now. And though I had to besmirch your name for the time being, I promise you, even if it is the last thing I ever do in this world, I will have you exonerated. One day, you will be known as the legendary figure that you were, a man who sacrificed his life for the sake of routing out and destroying enemies within the German Reich, who, if left to their own devices, would fester and rot until everything became ruin. The future I build going forward, an era of peace, prosperity, and global hegemony for Germany and its people. It is all thanks to your heroic sacrifice. Though I have no idea if your martyrdom will be looked kindly upon by our Father in heaven, I pray for your soul's safe passage to heaven, even if you are deemed unworthy in the eyes of the Lord." And should I find out you were destined for a far more terrifying place, I will rally my banners and march into hell itself to liberate you. Goodbye for now, Eric, and may we one day together meet again." After saying this, Bruno reached forward and grabbed the glass he had poured for Eric and slowly sipped its contents. And it was only after he had finished it that a call rang forth on his phone. Wiping the tears from his eyes and taking a moment to choke back the despair in his heart so that he was in a presentable face, Bruno accepted the call while listening to the voice on the other end. It was the voice of the leader of the Feldgendarmerie who stated one of 3 simple words before hanging up. "It is done." Upon hearing this, Bruno hung up his phone, silently standing up and approaching his office's mirror where he straightened his collar before placing his cap on his head. With the recent chaos that unfolded so suddenly, Bruno now would have to answer personally to the Kaiser about what he had done and why he had done it. Not that was an issue for him. Nevertheless, the groundwork had finally been laid for the German army to push into Paris without a thought in regards to the enemies lying behind them, as they had already been thoroughly eliminated. And in the coming days, any rats who may have been able to escape the trap laid for them would be hunted down and eliminated by the operatives of military intelligence and the Kaiser's secret police. One might look back upon this event in the future and remark that it was a flawless coup, something that was a bit of a rarity throughout history. As for the fate of the Imperial Police, it would be reorganized in the coming months into an institution that Bruno indirectly had control over. Chapter 363, A Hero of War. Having successfully pulled off one of the most brutally efficient coups in history, Bruno now had to answer to the only man in the German Reich who was of a higher power than him. The Kaiser would most certainly be wanting an explanation for what had happened, and unlike everyone else, Bruno did not plan to lie to the man. As a result, he made sure he was properly dressed and sober before ordering his car to take him to the Kaiser's personal palace, where he requested entry at its gates before being granted a military escort inside the building. By the time Bruno met with the Kaiser, it was late at night. Nevertheless, the man seems to be sitting in front of him within his office as alert as one could possibly be. Possibly because of the chaos that had been going on across his empire and the numerous agencies beneath his command desperately trying to figure out what was happening. Of course, with all the thoughts running through the Kaiser's head, he thought perhaps for a second Bruno may have turned against him. And because of this, he was quite furious, demanding an answer in a tone that sounded forcefully restrained. "Well, do you have an explanation for what you have done?" Bruno did not immediately respond to this, instead pulling out his briefcase, which had been thoroughly searched by the palace security before handing over multiple folders containing all the relevant information of what he had been up to. As the Kaiser read the documents, his eyes bulging in shock as he tried his damnedest to contain his disbelief, Bruno explained to him exactly what had happened. "Tomorrow the papers will print that the Imperial Police tried to derail the war effort and plunge the German Reich into defeat despite victory being near. They will say that my close friend and subordinate officer Oberst Erich von Humboldt was coerced into acting as an assassin on their behalf, being used as a blade to eliminate prominent figures of finance, industry, and the military in an attempt to sabotage the military. This is 100% pure and unadulterated bullshit. As you can see, Erich was acting under my orders to personally silence men guilty of conspiring against the German Reich and the House of Hohenzollern. These are men who have personally broken bread with you and your family at your table, under your own roof. Men who have close personal ties to not only your house, but the House of Habsburg and several other German monarchs. Men of supreme power, wealth, and authority who, if allowed to do what you can see there in your hands were indeed plotting to do, would have crippled us the moment we began to invade France. This conspiracy is large and coordinated, and I have been fighting it on my own for many years. The Imperial Police are indeed guilty of many of the crimes they were accused of, but they did not kill those people. I did, and I killed their families too, much to my own damnation. But these were threats that have been festering for generations, a disease that would have ruined us all if left to fester for several more. What I have done was necessary to save the German Reich and to save the legitimacy of you and your house. The narrative has been carefully crafted to pin the blame on my friend Erich and the Imperial Police. But what you hold in your hands is the last copy of evidence that exists in this world of the truth. You can keep that, expose the truth, or burn it. Frankly, I don't really care. But I felt you should know the truth of what happened here this night, and the price that was paid by a good and loyal soldier to ensure that your reign and the German Reich, which we love and cherish, remains strong and prosperous." The Kaiser was so bewildered by Bruno's actions and everything that had happened, but the evidence was undeniable. There was no mistaking it, and because of this he eventually placed the folder down and collected his thoughts before asking the immediate questions on his mind. "I have two questions. Why would you do all of this behind my back and not inform me of these traitors who were so close to me and my family that they could have stuck a knife in our backs at any moment? And two, where is Eric now?" Bruno's voice was cold and emotionless as he answered the first question with a tone that was purely matter of fact. In no way could there be any communication between us should this endeavor mine had ended up failing miserably. The very idea of the Kaiser sanctioning such a killing spree, which included innocent people who were guilty simply by association, would destroy the very fabric of our society and incite revolt. No, if I were to have been defeated by my rivals, then I would go down in flames alone. I would never risk dragging your name and that of your family through the mud with me. And ample preparations were already made to ensure that my family was able to safely flee to Russia. Even with me gone, the preparations I have made for the invasion of France were still intact, and we would have won this war in a matter of months. Albeit would likely be facing a firing squad, it was a calculated risk to maintain the integrity of your dynasty and its right to rule. As for your second question, Bruno's face suddenly became complicated. It existed for only a flash of time, but the Kaiser recognized a degree of pain and agony on Bruno's face and in his sky-blue eyes that he had never seen before, proving that despite the man's overwhelming cruelty and wicked actions, he was not a psychopath or sociopath devoid of empathy or remorse. And his words echoed this sentiment, even if not outright admitting them. "I did what had to be done, and Eric, he knew his fate was sealed the moment he agreed to my request. Like I said, a heavy price was paid to ensure the foundation of the future that you build as a result of our upcoming victory is set in stone. For years, decades even, Eric will be remembered as a traitor. But perhaps one day the truth of his heroism will come to life, when that truth no longer threatens the fabric of our society. Now, I have a question for you, my Kaiser. What do you intend to do with the evidence I have given you?" As much as the Kaiser wished to deny Bruno's words or condemn him, the evidence was overwhelming. Generations of conspiracy to gain wealth, power, and influence over European monarchs and societies, all in an attempt to destroy them. The war that was being waged right now was an extension of this ill will, and Bruno had single-handedly been fighting it in the shadows for years. After thinking about it for several minutes in complete and total silence, the Kaiser pulled out a nearby metal waste bin and lit it aflame, tossing the evidence Bruno had voluntarily provided him into its heat, forever destroying what proof existed that could possibly connect Bruno to all that he had done. Afterwards, the Kaiser sat down in front of Bruno and pulled out 2 glasses from his desk along with a bottle of his favorite spirits. And after doing so, he finally spoke his mind. "I think the truth is what we make of it. Now, tell me all about this friend of yours, Oberst Erich von Humboldt. Tell me his story. I would like to know more about the man to whom my house owes a great deal of gratitude, which it can never fully repay." Upon hearing this, Bruno wore a bitter smile as he shared several drinks with the Kaiser over the course of the night, regaling the man with all the stories he had of his years together with Eric and the brotherhood they had shared. The last drink of the night was settled with a toast to the heroic sacrifice. To Eric, a hero of war. Chapter 364, Death Before Dishonor. Bruno had stayed up all night discussing his stories with Eric from the time they first met, and he was the most entitled brat he had ever met in his life, all the way up until his bitter end. Discussions were had that depicted Eric as he was, not some romanticized friend who was only displayed in a good light to the Kaiser. As painful as it was recounting these tales, especially those that were brutal, in the end Bruno knew that Eric would have risen from the grave and haunted him for life if he dared dishonor the man's memory by lying about him. By the end, the Kaiser had a better understanding of the man who had sacrificed everything to fulfill orders that, while cruel and ruthless, were necessary for the long-term stability and survival of the German Reich. In the end, the Kaiser, perhaps having fully realized the true horrors of war and what they could truly do to a man, remained silent. By now the two men had long since switched from alcohol to coffee, sobering themselves up as best as they could manage in order to prepare for the new day. Upon seeing the complicated and bitter smile on Bruno's face, Wilhelm asked the man a question that he was not the least bit expecting. "Tell me, Bruno, how has a lifetime of war affected you? From what you tell me, by the end of his life your friend Eric had become incapable of living in a time of peace. Are you wounded in such a way as well?" Bruno suddenly became stern as he thought about this question in solemn silence for a long time, before placing his coffee mug on the table and uncrossing his legs. After doing so, he was quick to answer with his true thoughts on the matter. "Honestly, had you asked me this same question and demanded the truth from me at the start of the war, I would have told you nothing terrifies me more than coming home from the war and living in the peace after the gunshots have settled. After what I have done, what I have ordered men to do, how can I ever face my wife and children with my bloodstained hands? I'm honestly not sure when it happened, as it seems so long ago from my own perspective. But I have found my peace, my family, and the love they bear for me. They are the reason I can never allow myself to slip into the darkness that is ever reaching towards me." Wilhelm nodded slightly. He didn't say what he meant, but his eyes conveyed it perfectly. There had been a great worry in the man's mind that perhaps Bruno and his cruelty was growing out of hand. This, combined with the immense power he wielded, made Bruno the greatest threat the Hohenzollern dynasty and its reign. As much as Wilhelm thought of Bruno as a good friend, he was indeed worrying about Bruno's mental state as Bruno began to devise ever-increasing destructive weapons for the sake of war. Many of these concerns had been assuaged with this discussion, but there was still one left on the Kaiser's mind, which he was quick to give voice to. "Have you ever thought of pursuing a career in politics? You have the makings of a great statesman, or dare I say, an emperor." Bruno instantly rejected the notion, not even giving himself the time to think, as if the very idea was reprehensible to him. "No, my place is on the battlefield, keeping your enemies at bay, and reminding them there is always a greater force of evil in this world that they are not prepared to deal with. I may have the skills to be an efficient statesman, but that is not my cross to bear, and only if it were absolutely necessary to preserve the Reich and the continued legitimacy of your dynasty would I ever accept such a burden." It was hard to believe such ammon existed. Sure, Wilhelm valued his friendship with Bruno, but sometimes the loyalty which Bruno showed him, and the fervor in which he served, willingly, when he could easily have it all, it was hard to believe a man lacked such ambition when the power was well within his grasp. He need only reach out and take it, and he could become the most powerful man in the world. So much so that the Kaiser could not help but be wary, and was forced to ask the next question on his mind, even if it risked insulting a close friend. Still, if you ran for chancellor, it might be the closest thing to a unanimous mandate of the people's history as ever seen in a free and fair election. You're popular with the lower class, the working class, and the upper class. Only the ancient nobility, despite you, and they are not large enough in number to affect such an outcome. On the one hand, you would be chancellor, having unrivaled political power, and on the other hand the military, or at least a large part of it, would be loyal to you before all else after what you have done for them. Military, political, and economic strength unrivaled in the world, and yet, you dare to tell me you don't desire it. Bruno obviously knew what the Kaiser was getting at, and understood his intentions for doing so. Only a creature with the mind of prey would ignore the threat sitting in front of him. And because of this, Bruno was quick to respond honestly once more, as honesty was his only way out of this precarious situation he had suddenly found himself in. "Oh, by all means, I am not some saint or divine-like entity who is immune to corrupting influence of human nature. There will always be that voice in the back of my head, whispering to me to commit sins that would damn me for eternity. The devil is ever present in each of us, and if it were so easy to reject his influence, then we would all be destined for heaven's gates, would we not? But to do what you have subtly implied, and pursue greater power for my own interests, well then the chaos that would cause would surely damn us all, now wouldn't it? No, I have but one life to give, one life to sacrifice. For my family, my nation, my people, my Kaiser. And there is no temptation on this earth great enough to sway me from my purpose. I am what you need me to be, nothing more, nothing less. To desire more, and to selfishly act upon it, especially if it were to cost us everything. How could I ever face those who have already made the greatest sacrifice under my orders when I see them in the next life? Your Majesty, I chose the words of my house, or at least the cadet branch of my house, not because they sound nice, but because they are words which I have sought to live by, and most certainly will die by when the time comes to do so. My honor is loyalty. Loyalty to you, to the Reich, and to its people. And while I understand your concerns, considering the enigma that I am when compared to other men throughout history, at the end of the day, I am a soldier, not an emperor. After saying this, the sun began to rise high in the air, and Bruno used this as his chance to leave, requesting permission to do so, as if emphasizing the point one final time. Well, would you look at that? The two of us have been up all night. My wife must be worried sick about me, so may I please be excused? The Kaiser gave a silent nod of his head and spent the rest of the morning contemplation his conversation with Bruno and every interaction had in it. One thing was certain at the end of his introspection. Bruno was either the most loyal man who could serve him or the most capable liar in human history. And judging by Bruno's track record and willingness to hand him the evidence of his own wrongdoing, the Kaiser was willing to bet his life and the fortunes of his family on the former. Any potential concerns he may have had of Bruno slipping into madness or desiring his throne had come to a sudden halt, especially since Eric's death seemed to be a heavy anchor for Bruno's own sense of duty, loyalty, and obligation. As for Bruno, he ultimately decided to return home and get some proper rest. Heidi was not remotely displeased with her husband. In fact, she was gratefully concerned about his whereabouts the entire night and what he had been up to. After enough time, she performed a personal investigation into what had happened and concluded that Bruno had earned a night off to drink with the Kaiser. Bruno was indeed surprised to find his wife waiting for him in their bedroom when he tried to get some rest. He thought at first she would be mad that he had stayed out all night without explanation. But when the man tried to defend himself, his wife simply raised her finger to his lips before hugging him tightly, a somber expression on her otherwise flawless face, before she whispered the words into Bruno's ears that he would never forget. Shoo, forget about everything that has happened. You are home now. Let me help you get dressed into something comfortable so that we can get some proper rest. Together. Despite Bruno's absolute refusal to cry in front of his wife, he fell asleep in her arms, as she too slept by her man's side, hugging him tightly, and assuring him that the world had indeed not ended after the events of the previous night. Heidi would not leave Bruno's arms until the man himself felt he was ready to do so, and naturally orders had been given to the estate's staff throughout the night to prepare for such an eventuality, meaning that Bruno had all the time he needed to properly recover from the shock of the previous night. Chapter 365, Mysteries of the Departed. Bruno awoke late in the afternoon feeling groggy and fatigued, hungover even, as he had consumed far too much alcohol during the grieving process of losing Eric. News had not immediately spread of what had been done and who officially was held responsible. But the moment Bruno finally managed to climb down his stairs after taking a proper shower to wash away the sweat accumulated in his sleep and dressing himself appropriately for the day, he found that sitting in his foyer was none other than a familiar face. One that did not seem the least bit pleased to see him. Heinrich, of course, did not immediately comment. He carefully observed Bruno's behavior and appearance before finally sighing and making a remark to try to lighten the mood and address this serious matter with a less heavy tone. Judging by your ungodly appearance and the lateness to which you have slept, I'm assuming the rumors are true then? Bruno did not say anything, instead silently nodding his head as he passed by Heinrich, and quickly entered the kitchen to grab a pot of coffee, which had been kept hot by his servants for his eventual awakening. Heinrich naturally followed the man into the dining room, where he saw Bruno sit at the table. There was no paper in his hands. He not needed to read the lies which were printed under his own guidance, and this only further confirmed Heinrich's suspicions. He did not immediately address the elephant in the room, instead waiting patiently and silently for Bruno to say the words himself. And finally, the man groaned and sighed, casting an accusatory glance at the only other man he had held such a close brotherhood to. You want to know if I am the one behind all of this? Do you want me to confess openly to you what you already understand? If I didn't know you better, I would suspect you of trying to set me up with such suspicious behavior. We both know what truly happened, so let's leave it at that for now, shall we? Bruno immediately returned his gaze to the cup of coffee in his hands, drinking down its contents as if it were the smoothest and most savory of liquids. All the while Heinrich began to speak of Eric's character in a far more somber and grim tone. He and I always had our disagreements, especially over the ethics of his behavior, but I never thought it would end for him like this. Bruno did not immediately respond, continuing with his silent grumbling for some time before finally changing the topic altogether. Your daughter, how is she handling this matter? A familiar voice called out to Bruno from behind as Alia entered the room. She had been waiting in the other room where Heinrich was first seated. Bruno had been so fatigued he had not even seen her when he walked by, and her voice was far from pleased. I lost one of my godfathers, and now everyone is saying his is some kind of traitor to the German Reich when I know better than that. How the hell do you think I feel? Bruno was quick to turn around and stare at the young maiden whose ears were filled with tears, causing him to immediately question her attitude. Bruno had not spent nearly as much time with Alia over the years as his wife and son had. Because of this, his understanding of her character was rather shallow, mostly based upon outdated information from when she was but a little girl. I thought you were terrified of Eric? What changed? As if offended by the mere assertion, Alia scoffed and rolled her eyes only after understanding Bruno had been so busy with managing the affairs of the German Reich and looking after his own family, that he had truly spent far less time with her than Eric had, and may not even be aware of the extent Eric had helped them over the years. Of course, you know I used to be frightened by you too, but that was a long time ago, and as fearsome as a figure as Uncle Eric was, he was also a deeply tragic soul, one that you made and added to every time you ordered him to. Heinrich was quick to order a cessation to Alia's rant, as what she was doing was extremely rude to Bruno whose home they were in. Not only that, but the man she was insulting to his face was also in an obvious bad mood, and interfering now before she could say anything further was prudent. Alia, enough. Go take a breather. Your godfather and I need to speak in private. Alia's face immediately became flustered, but she had enough emotional maturity and grace to realize what she had done in a moment of frustration and grief, solemnly bowing her head and apologizing to Bruno and her adopted father as she obeyed the man's command. I'm terribly sorry. That was uncouth of me. Please forgive my outburst just now. I will do as you say, father. After saying this, the woman marched off, clearly still angered by the whole situation. Bruno, now curious about matters he did not understand, was quick to ask about it. Since when were you and Eric so close? Heinrich sighed and shook his head before explaining the matter in further detail, but just cryptic enough to leave matters as they should be. It's no fault of your own that you don't understand. You have the entirety of the Reich to look after and the well-being of your family. It's only natural that you would not be an active part of the girl's life. Let's just say the reason I have been willing to tolerate that murderous bastard all these years is because despite his brutality, cruelty, and ruthlessness bordering on the outright sadistic, he was a man who was still capable of showing some kindness towards those who were close to him. And since his relationship with his own family became estranged as a result of your attempts at humor, over the years had dropped by our place frequently to help us when you were unavailable to do so. He was not a man suited for peace, and was something akin to a monster trying his best to prevent the demon from possessing him. But he still deserved better than this. Bruno looked perplexed at the complexity with which Heinrich had used to paint their fallen friend. A side of the man existed that Bruno never knew about. And when Heinrich was about to stand up and walk away, Bruno reached out to him with one last comment. The last time I saw Eric, he mentioned something about finally settling down and becoming an honest man. I presumed he meant he had a fiancée. I must confess that until now, I never had the time to look into the matter. Would you perhaps know her name? I would very much like to pay my respects. Heinrich looked back at Bruno with a look of confusion on his face, before expressing his ignorance outright entirely. Eric had a fiancée? This is the first I am hearing about it. The two men sat there in silence for a long time, contemplating on the mystery of the man they had known for so many years, and how little they may have both understood about him after all. Chapter 366. Desertion. France had passed emergency defense measures to protect the nation's borders in the event of a major offensive, which they knew was only a matter of time before it began. The most heinous of which was full-scale conscription. Every man of proper age capable of being sent into the army to defend the borders was drafted to do so. Meanwhile, volunteer battalions consisting of teenage boys old enough to bear arms but not old enough to join the army were gathered, along with the elderly still youthful enough to do the same. The pejorative term volontold would be a more accurate description of these militias. Either way, France was doing its best to organize, train, and supply everyone who could possibly be mustered in its defense to do so. In theory, this could be an effective deterrent, albeit a last-ditch effort to preserve the Republic. But the reality was far more grim. By now, the Eighth Army was the spearhead of the German army, and the Second Army had undergone reorganization into a similar combined arms unit. These two forces would storm past any defenses France could muster with damn near impunity and mow over human wave tactics with ease. At the same time, these conscripts would neither have the training, experience, or sheer strength of will to hold the line under such a brutal onslaught. Defeat was certain, there was no doubt of this. How long could such tactics could stall this reality? And to what greater degree of casualties would they incur? Nobody knew. But to do so would surely cause the death of the Republic in the end, as the families of those who had been sent to their deaths for no just reason would demand the blood of the elected officials and unelected bureaucrats who had dispatched them to such a gruesome end. However, the reality was that either way the Third French Republic was doomed to fall in this war, and there was nothing at this point they could do to stop it. Even if surrender was an option, the damage done to the people's trust in their current form of government was too much to be redeemed. So rather than accept this reality, the French leadership tried to put all their hopes in a mass mobilization, one which would only make their end that much more miserable when the time for the gallows came to find them. Currently, there were young French boys dressed in civilian clothing being taught how to handle rifles within the borders of the city of Paris. The youngest of them were perhaps 12, while the oldest of them was around 16. Considering their circumstances, they were equipped with much older rifles from preceding generations, which was less than ideal for their smaller statures, as the calibers used in those weapons were more ideal for hunting the largest game in Europe and North America rather than humans. Bang, a line of shots were fired in succession, not unison, while the boys laid on the ground in a prone position, not even wearing steel helmets as they tried their best to hit the targets spread out a few dozen meters in front of them. Unlike in places like the United States, where it was common for young boys to learn marksmanship skills in pursuit of hunting, especially in more rural areas of the country, such traditions were far less common in European countries, especially the likes of France. Because of this, these boys who had limited access to supplies and even fewer resources to training had performances which one might expect of their circumstances. The bullets landed wildly across their targets, with one boy managing to hit a bullseye, if not for the fact that it was on someone else's target, an act that was so obvious it received verbal condemnation from the French soldier trying his best to instruct this group of child soldiers. "My God, we have an expert marksman here. Congratulations, you have just killed a German soldier in the year 1815. You absolute little shit. Do you think the enemy will be lining up with their muskets to fire at you? This isn't the Battle of Waterloo, you dunce. Now reload and try again." The boy was young, perhaps 12 or 13, but he had been enduring the harsh tone of the instructor for days now and was well accustomed to it. He pulled back the bolt of his Fusil Gras MLE 1874, which while extracting the spent cartridge did not outright eject it. Instead, the boy was forced to tilt the rifle, so that gravity forced the cartridge to fall before putting another of the mammoth-sized cartridges into the chamber, where he slammed the bolt forward before pulling the trigger once more. The shot once more missed, causing the instructor to facepalm before dismissing the boys for the day entirely out of hopelessness. "Never mind. That is all the ammunition you are allotted for the day. Go continue your marching practice." The boys quickly unloaded their weapons and made sure they were properly cleared before popping up and saluting the instructor. After doing so, they ran off to visit their next instructor who would help them on their marching. As for the instructor, he continued to look off into the distance where they had run off to, pulling a packet of cigarettes out from his coat and lighting one aflame. where he took a long and heavy drag before expelling the smoke from his lungs entirely. Having done this, and only after he did so, did he finally reveal his thoughts on the current situation of the Third French Republic and those within it. It looks like Paris is going to drown in blood before this is all said and done. The Republic is over. Long live whoever's reign comes next. After saying this, the instructor walked off. Having seen this, and done everything he could to try to make sure the boys could at least defend themselves, even with their limited resources, he had decided he would not remain to watch the slaughter, and instead fled the country, deserting his post in the middle of the night at the most opportune moment. This was a sentiment that many French soldiers, especially those who had been around throughout the conflict and survived this long, had begun to share in a criminal act they also chose to engage in. Chapter 367. The Autumn Offensive begins Part 1. For the German Reich and the nations composed of its European allies, the weeks and months that followed Eric's death were one of largely logistical preparedness for the forthcoming theater of war. Millions of men and supplies were switched from Italy, the Caucasus, and the Balkans towards the Western Front. At the same time, Austro-Hungary and the Russian Empire did their best to produce as many tanks as they feasibly could for the upcoming push into France. Sure, France tried its best to do the same, but there were limits to what they could reasonably achieve without the support of Britain and its industry. When compared to the industrial potential of its three adversaries, as Greece would be sitting out of this major battle and instead focus on consolidating their gains, France was at an overwhelming disadvantage. Because of this, the atmosphere in Paris was glum, especially as militias composed primarily of children and the elderly marched through the streets with makeshift uniforms and rifles in their hands. Some of the old veterans wore the same uniforms they had been deployed with in wars of the preceding century, carrying the same weapons they used then, now in 1916. It was a truly depressing sight, as many of the Parisian locals were inclined towards fleeing the city, and perhaps the country altogether towards their colonial possessions that were for the time being more stable. The idea of the German, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian armies breaking through the lines of defense and marching into Paris was indeed a terrifying prospect for many, and because of this, as the days past, the capital of France became ever more grim and despaired. Meanwhile, Germany was quite the opposite, having finally received a sizable form of aid from its allies, of all of which were mustering to the Western Front. Those who had been holding the line for so long were immediately relieved of their positions, allowing newer and fresher men to man the posts until the offensive truly began. Every second of every day, armored trains transporting the overwhelming number of men, guns, munitions, and armored vehicles from across the world into the Western Front continued on their journey without incident, flowing perfectly like a perfectly well-oiled machine. Soon the autumn offensive of 1916 would begin, and in doing so Bruno would bring the Great War to an end. Because of this, he was focused on these days making sure every piece of equipment could be accounted for. Germany was producing tanks at a rate of 20-30 per day, while half-tracks were at an even higher rate, allowing for the creation of more than one combined arms army by the time the autumn offensive was to begin. As for Austro-Hungary and Russia, they were at a much lower rate of output current. But, with the advancements Bruno had made into their empires prior to the outbreak of the war, they were in a much better position than France was in. Because of this, the transport of men and equipment to the Western Front was monumental in scale. Bruno was currently sitting within his household, at his dinner table with his entire family there, enjoying what they knew would be the last meal they would share together for a while. Erwin had been granted leave for this purpose, and because of this he was in a rather glum mood, as he realized his father was once more off to the front lines, where his life would be at risk. Still, the idea that his father would be leading the charge to take down France, Germany's historically greatest and most hated enemy, and humbling the nation of baguette munchers was a matter of great pride for the adolescent boy. And while they all ate in silence with complicated emotions, Bruno revealed his thoughts on the matter, breaking the awkward atmosphere with a bit of humor, posing a question to his second youngest daughter, Elsa, that she was not expecting. "Since I will be taking a brief trip to Paris, is there anything in particular you kid would want me to bring home as a souvenir? What about you, Elsa?" Elsa did not initially say a word. She understood what her father was trying to do, but still felt fearful of his soon-to-be departure. It was the same whenever he said goodbye, and she supposed it was also an identical experience across the world, for every child or lover of a man of war. The fear and anxiety were enough to grip her heart and crush it into a bloody pulp. But ultimately, she mustered the strength to shake her head and deny her father's request with a meek tone muttered beneath her breath. "No, I just want you to return as swiftly as possible and without injury." Bruno could only shake his head and sigh. His attempts to break the ice had failed, and he supposed it would be a rather grim and somber evening for them all. As a result, he went back to silently eating his food. The night would not be kind to him as he thought about what was to come and the horrors he would once more have to endure. But by morning, he was dressed in his field uniform, with his wife ensuring that his collar was in the right position while they both stared in the mirror. There was an obviously forced smile on the woman's face, as she knew there was a very real possibility she would see her husband, her provider, and the love of her life. Heidi was about to speak the words consuming her rationality when Bruno leaned down and kissed his wife's lips, first gently and then passionately. After doing so, Bruno finally forced himself from his wife's vice-like grip before assuring her everything would be fine. "I promise you, I will always return here to your side, no matter what hell I have to go through to do so. The devil himself could not keep me locked away from your loving embrace. Now, I'm sorry, but duty calls." After saying this, Bruno patted his wife's silky golden hair before leaving their bedroom, silently kissing the foreheads of his sleeping children before taking a military armored convoy to the train station, where he would board an armored train headed towards the borders with Luxembourg, which was where the Eighth Army had consolidated since its victory in Italy. With this, the autumn offensive had begun. Chapter 368, The Autumn Offensive begins Part 2. The Germans had spent countless man-hours over the past few months clearing the mines that remained between their fortifications and the enemy, which lie beyond no man's land. It was a task that the French could only sit by and watch as the enemy prepared for their major offensive, as all means to repel or destroy the German armor proved wildly ineffective. But this roar of tank engines across the entirety of the Western Front had given the French a false sense of security on a psychological level. They were so accustomed to hearing such sounds that they would not think twice of it, to the point where today, September 22, 1916, the German Eighth Army situation on the borders of Germany and Luxembourg began its push, which was accompanied by hordes of German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian soldiers across the entirety of the Western Front. But this was not immediately recognized by the weary and fatigued French soldiers, many of which had resorted to daytime drinking and drug abuse to handle the shell shock they were all inflicted with. One of the men was currently injecting heroin into his arm as the rain poured down upon his head. His helmet was somewhere or another, not that he really knew, as he neglected his post in favor of a much-needed sedation. There was just one major problem with this approach. He was so zonked out of his mind that he could not determine the ever-increasing sound of the enemy engines approaching his position, and many of his comrades were in a similar state of intoxication as the German armored vehicles ever closed in on their position. And then suddenly there was an explosion, engulfing him and his nearby comrades in an instant. A combination barrage of Nebelwerfers and self-propelled artillery had begun to strike the front lines of France's currently controlled positions in Luxembourg, obliterating its poorly constructed defenses and turning the men within them to meat paste. Those who had survived the initial bombardment were quick to attempt to flee, as they looked over the wall of the trench and saw that an overwhelming number of armored vehicles were advancing into no man's land and assaulting their position. The autumn offensive had begun, and the French soldiers supposed to be the tip of the spear had been caught completely with their pants down. The reaction, of course, was to fall further back and reinforce rear lines as the vanguard had already been obliterated by overwhelming power. The echoes of artillery continued to resound throughout the distance as smoke clouds and fire emerged throughout all sectors of the French front lines. From the borders of Germany all the way to the top of Belgium, war had erupted seemingly out of nowhere. And the French, who had been trying their best to prepare for this reality in advance, soon found themselves not only running from the artillery dropping on their position every second of the day, but also from the bombs being dropped on their heads from the thousands of He-51 planes which flew over the skies of Luxembourg with absolute impunity. It was like an army of hell, and its demons had been deployed to deal with what little France could muster in its defense, and they brought the hellfire with them. French communications were absolutely haywire as they were being assaulted on every front imaginable, making it difficult to understand where best to respond with reinforcements. Charles de Gaulle, who witnessed the barrage ceasefire within his sector outside Ypres far further north from Luxembourg, was quick to give an order with a deep and melancholy sigh as he witnessed the combination of German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian armored units act as a spearhead to cover the advance of their infantry, knowing that the French had nothing to harm them with. Crushing over barbed wire and bodies alike, flattening them for the infantry to walk over with ease, the French general lowered his binoculars and pinched his brow while surrendering immediately. Wave the white flag. There is no victory to be had. Soldiers who were already sick and tired of their generals trying to sacrifice their lives needlessly for medals were quick to give in and throw aside their weapons, raise their hands in the air, and fly the flag of submission. Not long thereafter, soldiers of the Central Powers rushed past the armored units which protected them and entered the trenches wielding their automatic rifles in their hands as they secured the surrendered French soldiers who were greatly contrasted to their own appearance. The German uniforms were neatly cleaned and pressed, not the slightest sign of stains or blemish. Their bodies were clean, and their faces properly shaved. The French soldiers, however, looked like they had emerged from the thick jungle without seeing the light of day for years. Haggard and harrowed eyes, untrimmed and uncouth beards, followed by mud, blood, and grease stains all over their skin, uniforms, and weapons. As for the state of their equipment, poorly maintained, was an understatement. The fit, strong, and tidy soldiers of the Central Powers looked at the men in front of them who appeared as if they had not eaten a proper meal in at least 3 days with pity and concern in their own eyes as they tried to ensure that the men were properly apprehended, collected, and taken as prisoners of war. Charles de Gaulle would be amazed when he returned to a prisoner of war camp later that day, that not only was it the same camp he had previously escaped from, but the men inside its walls were far better off mentally, physical, and spiritually than those who had been living and fighting in the trenches for the sake of the French Republic. In fact, when the French and British prisoners of war, who had yet to be returned to their homeland, saw the sorry state of the French prisoners who were marched through the entrance of the camp, they were astonished at how badly things had gotten. And as the war continued, this jarring contrast would only continue to become clearer. Chapter 369. The Autumn Offensive begins Part 3. From the northernmost tip where Belgium and France met, to the most southern end where France aligned with Germany, a singular push began from all ends. In what could easily be considered the largest military offensive in human history, millions of Germans, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian troops rushed over the wire and to the positions here France had tried their best to invade their enemies' lands from over the course of the last 2 years. This overwhelming volume of infantry larger equipped with Fedorov Avtomat battle rifles and MG-34 general-purpose machine guns were supported by large-scale artillery operations conducted by 75 mm, 105 mm, 152 mm, 172 mm, and 211 mm variants, which preceded their attacks. At critical areas, these infantry charges were shielded by thousands of armored cars, half-tracks, and light tanks. With the two combined armed armies pushing though from Luxembourg and Ypres, the hopes were that these armies would simultaneously strike at Paris from the north and the east and combine together to form a perimeter where they would maintain a siege over the French capital until further reinforcements arrived to seize it, and in doing so hopefully end the war immediately. Typically, throughout history, a war ended when a belligerent nation's capital was seized by its enemy. And the reason for this was self-explanatory. If one's political center was captured and their leaders with it, it was very easy to force them to surrender. Exceptions to this general rule of thumb in the history of warfare were rare, but generally pertained to incidents where a nation's governing body escaped the capture of its capital in a sufficient enough capacity to command forces while in exile. Perhaps in anticipation of such an event, Bruno had used his influence to task the combined naval might of the Central Powers and the nations within it to impose a blockade over all ports of the French mainland the moment the armistice with Great Britain had been declared. Months had passed, strangling the trade between France and the rest of the world, as its only neighbors being Spain and Italy were either under direct treaty not to provide aid to France, or were heavily pressured by the nations of the Central Powers to do so. This, of course, crippled France in many ways as the months passed in anticipation of this offensive. The lack of raw materials necessary for producing weapons, munitions, and just about everything that was critical to the war effort became apparent quite quickly, as did fuel shortages for maintaining France's energy grid. Following this were the fields of medicine and agriculture. To put it simply, by the beginning of the autumn offensive of 1916, France's economy had been strangled into submission, despite the government's refusal to surrender. And this had only compounded revolutionary activity across the countryside as bands of political extremists of all sides, brigands, and deserters wreaked havoc within the war-torn nation. Lawlessness prevailed, and whatever hopes the French had in throwing bodies at the wave of steel coming over their border in the east broke when the desertion crisis outweighed the number of new conscripts 3:1. Especially as the violence engulfed the French front lines, killing or capturing hundreds of thousands of starving and disease-riddled French soldiers who were aghast to find their comrades who had been imprisoned for the last 2 years in German POW camps being treated as if they were on a vacation. From proper housing with central heating, fresh rations, and routine access to luxuries such as swimming pools and medical care, the French POWs had been given first-class treatment not only as a strategic move to ensure no additional hatred was fostered to Germany during their confinement, but also to break whatever will of defiance the French army had left as they realized that Germany as a nation was so economically unfazed by the war that they could provide better treatment to their POWs than even the wealthiest of Frenchmen could currently buy for themselves. Charles de Gaulle could barely believe his eyes after being processed, cleaned, and given a nice hot meal, as he saw the men he had fought beside in the past, currently chatting up with the German guards and smoking cigarettes with them while talking about the ongoing state of the war as if neither were enemies, but rather friends. He had personally fought so hard to escape this exact prison camp, and in doing so had returned to the front lines to suffer for so long, expecting violent reprisals to have taken place because of his actions. This anger towards the Germans who he believed executed his former comrades as retaliation had fueled him to continue the war even when there was obviously no sign of victory. But those very men were still alive, well-fed, and groomed, chatting in German with the prisoner of war camp's guards as if they were not soldiers of the Republic captured by a hated enemy, but were instead members of the German army themselves. A look of pity appeared in the French POW's eyes as he looked over at the newest recruits and shook his head while sharing a cigarette with the German guard, speaking in perfect German, which he had been encouraged to learn over the last 2 years, and had even been given lessons in by his captors. It's a pity, isn't it? The state of the latest crop of POWs has deteriorated even worse than the last batch. I fear for what is happening in my homeland if our soldiers are disheveled and emaciated to such a degree. How many of my people have starved to death? How many have been killed for a loaf of bread? All because our politicians can never forget what happened in Versailles all those years ago. I pray to God that when I return home, there is still a home to be had. The German guard who wore a hat with the cockade of Bavaria finished off the cigarette before reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a rosary, handing it to the French prisoner, as if to help the man with his prayers. The rosaries they provide to prisoners here are of subpar quality, in my opinion. I know it's not the intent of our superiors, but such materials are needed for the war effort, so they genuinely make do with whatever scrap remains behind. Take this. It was given to me by my mother when I was conscripted into the army. Luckily for me, I was sent to Feldgendarmerie, so it would appear you need this more than I do. I will keep your family in my prayers, and I hope they are well and safe once all this madness is over. The French POW was thankful to the guard who had given him such a valuable gift and was quick to show his appreciation with a proper handshake. You're a good man, Hans, and I will remember the kindness you have all shown me here during my stay. I'm sure when the time comes for us all to return home, we will do our best to rebuild and correct any falsehoods our people may have of our neighbors to the east. Now I think I am going to go to the chapel and say my prayers. Have a good rest of your shift." With this said, both men quickly and cordially went their separate ways, but not before giving a respectful salute to one another. Though Charles, who had witnessed the whole thing, had no idea what was said between them, he had seen the friendliness in their mannerisms and the gift exchange between them. This made him bitter and resentful. At himself, at his comrades, at his commanders, at the Republic, at Germany and its people. How could any of this have happened? For even French soldiers to treat the German soldiers this way? What next? Were they going to throw a parade when the Germans marched into Paris? Perhaps these men would let the German invaders fuck their wives and daughters as well. Maybe even clean up afterward. What kind of sick joke was this? Germany had treated its prisoners of war well beyond what they were required to by international convention, and it was for two primary purposes. Firstly, it was to break the will of the French army's resolve to fight, as previously mentioned, and second, it was to help ensure a potential Second World War did not occur in this timeline by having French POWs return home and counter any propaganda made against Germany and the Central Powers for their victory in this Great War. But whether or not either of those things happened had yet to be seen. At the very least, the French POWs who had been under German captivity up until this point were extremely thankful for the way they had been treated. And this could either be the start of a new era of peace or a catalyst for one of strife, as soldiers like Charles de Gaulle could potentially see them as traitors during the interwar period and let their petty jealousy and bitterness drive them to a position of civil war. For now, the autumn offensive had been started with a massive scale of violence, bloodshed, and death that history had yet to really see up to this point. Chapter 370: Conspiracies and False Flags. The world and humanity's place within it was forever changing, not only as a result of natural phenomena which shaped the earth and the way which its denizens interacted with it, but also as a result of changes within human society and civilization. Nothing lasted forever. Soon enough, time eroded even the most stalwart of institutions and monuments. And the same could be said for the current state of the world. Things were changing, mutating, and evolving at a rate that was perhaps unparalleled in human history. Civilizations were competing on a global stage in a war waged for a variety of reasons: natural resources, failed diplomacy, ideological differences, and of course, pride. Pride in a nation, pride in a faith, pride in the might have one's brother in arms as they marched to the drums of war. It was an inescapable reality from the shores of Gibraltar to the Cape of Good Hope, and all the way to the tropical woodlands of Southeast Asia. One by one, the nations which represented a reform form pre-Enlightenment ideals towards liberty and justice by the will of the people, rather than the divine right of kings and dynasties to rule and provide for their people, fell by the wayside. A tidal wave of steel overwhelmed them, while the individuals composed of their martial force were cut down like wheat to the scythe. The Central Powers had proven unstoppable as they ravaged Serbia, humbled Bulgaria, chained the Ottoman Empire, and brought its foundations to utter ruin. Next came Italy, so prideful in their own inadequacy that they thought they could seize the lands which they long since proclaimed ownership of, and spank those who had formerly snubbed them. The might of the British Navy had been swallowed by the Leviathan that was the German Kaiserlich Marine, particularly its insidious sea monsters lurking ever beneath the waves, hounding and hunting for any ship unfortunate enough to be caught in their path. Alone they were deadly, but when grouped together into a wolf pack, even more capable naval fleets must remain vigilant and cautious in passing through waters which had just 2 years prior been under their protection. The end result was the British Empire brought to heel and forced to bow out of the conflict prior to its absolute end. The disruption of social order within the homeland and its colonies had forced parliaments dissolvent after its members proved utterly incapable of finding an adequate solution. Now all that remained was France. Their only hope for victory lied in an ally across the Atlantic which had in years past reinforced the Monroe Doctrine and went full isolationist, with France being seen as the aggressors in this conflict, and the Central Powers providing no excuse for the more hawkish elements of the United States to latch onto as provocation. The end result was ultimately the fact that neither the American industry nor its military was properly suited towards this war. It would take at least a year with even the most coordinated of efforts to be able to industrialize itself in a way that was capable of negating the aggression of the Central Powers as they made a decisive push towards Paris at this very moment to end this bloody war once and for all. Woodrow Wilson and his backers were particularly furious, running on the campaign of preventing the fall of Europe's last bastion of democratic principles, and using the war as a way to revitalize the American industry, which had taken a massive hit as a result of its isolationist policies and its refusal to engage in trade with either alliance fighting in the Great War out of a fear of provoking them. For those most affected by this transition from a more globalized economy to a more self-sufficient one which was reliant on regional trade rather than trade abroad, Wilson's bid for the presidency was an appealing notion. But overall, the public was split, and because of this, the man was seething in his office while trying his best to remain calm in front of his advisors, who, of course, tried to express their opinions on the matter at hand. With all due respect, Mr. Wilson, even if you do manage to win over the public's support and gain the presidency, by the time you are inaugurated, the war will be over and France will have surrendered. If you consider the fact that the German Navy alone was capable of dismantling British dominion over the waves, we won't even have a chance to land forces on European soil. There is simply no point in trying. We might need another campaign promise to run on, as it is starting to appear like France will fall before Election Day. This reality was all too present on Woodrow Wilson's mind. France's front lines had been demolished in a mass mobilization of forces on its shared borders with the Central Powers nobody had ever thought possible. Germans, Belgians, Austro-Hungarians, and Russians all came over after hundreds of thousands of shells had been detonated against France's meager defenses. If the French army could not manage to cease its current route, then France would fall before winter could arrive. Heck, it was entirely possible the capital could be seized in the span of a fortnight at this rate. And if that occurred, the promises Woodrow Wilson had made to his voter base would die with the Third French Republic. No, America needed to find a way to enter the war before then, or else the man who would be king would never see his throne outside his own dreams. As a result, he was quick to sigh and shake his head as he tried to come up with some excuse that could rile the American public into a state of frenzy against the Central Powers, and quickly at that. Isn't there any scandal the Germans have engaged in which can be used to cause distrust and hatred against them in such a state that Congress would be forced to act? Wilson's aides looked at one another with grim expressions before shaking their heads. They were about to state that they had no evidence of the sort, when a young staff member with a cocky grin walked quick to give voice to his opinions. Maybe not the Germans themselves, but their allies in the Pacific have been exceptionally brutal in their regards to warfare against the British and French colonials. However, they seem to be acting under orders to spare POWs of American nationality, including those currently fighting in the Foreign Legion. We might be able to instigate a large volunteer corps to fake their nationalities and get slaughtered by the Japanese as POWs, and thus provoking the public's ire against the Central Powers as a whole. This suggestion of a false flag attack, by luring the Japanese into committing war crimes against American POWs currently serving in the French Foreign Legion within French Indochina, was exactly the kind of scheme Woodrow Wilson desired, and his frown turned upside down into a sadistic smirk as he asked for more information with the most devilish tone possible. Go on. A long conversation ensued regarding the feasibility of conducting such a false flag operation, which was far more feasible in this timeline than in Bruno's previous one. In Bruno's past life, the IJ had been quite fair with their treatment of German colonial soldiers in the Pacific during the Great War, only going out of their way to engage in unnecessary cruelty in the wars towards the defeat in the wars that would follow in the subsequent decades. But perhaps emboldened by advanced technology gained by Bruno's influence, and an increasing desire to be recognized as a true equal among the European powers, the Imperial Japanese Army had resulted to a level of sheer brutality and cruelty towards the European colonial soldiers that was only matched or even exceeding by their own behavior during the Second World War of the previous timeline. As a result, the more hawkish American politicians sought to use these indiscriminate war crimes as a way to enter the war before it was too late to do so. And because of this, after hearing a far more detailed report of what was going on in Southeast Asia, Woodrow Wilson snickered before commenting on his plans to gain the popular and electoral votes in the coming election that would grant him the presidency on a silver platter. The American people don't care about what savages on the other side of the world do to one another for fun, but exposing their war crimes against proper civilized Europeans, and more importantly American citizens, now that would at the very least be a good start in tearing down the legitimacy of my opponent and his position. Can such a thing be arranged? Though the other two aides in the room tried to persuade the presidential candidate against this course of action, the devil on his shoulders in the form of the smug young intern was quick to silence them and reinforce Wilson's own wicked tendencies with poisonous suggestions and assurances. It can indeed be arranged, and I can assure recorded results and photographs on every headline across the United States of America within half a fortnight at the latest. Thus, a formal conspiracy to sacrifice American citizens in order to win Woodrow Wilson the presidency and support an American entry into the war on behalf of the Allied powers had begun. But whether it was too late or just in time to save France from a swift defeat had yet to be seen. Chapter 371: Run Through the Jungle. Deep within the jungles of Indochina, a French soldier ran with a machine gun in his hands as gunfire and mortars erupted around him. The weapon he used was neither a French heavy machine gun like the Putix or the Hotchkiss, nor recent developments in French light machine guns like the Chauchat. His unit of legionnaires had run out of ammunition for their own weapons a very long time ago, and resupply was almost non-existent, as the state of France and its current colonial empire tore at the seams. No, he carried one of the Japanese machine guns with multiple belts of ammunition wrapped around his chest. Ammunition scavenged from his kills in the field. Currently, however, the position he and his unit were ordered to hold was being overwhelmed by the combined might of the Royal Thai Army and the Imperial Japanese Army, who had run through the gap in between the trenches without any regard for their own well-being. With France's ability to send shipments abroad being entirely nullified by the Central Powers blockade, there was simply no hope for those men sent to protect French colonial assets overseas. Ammunition was scarce enough already, and when the enemy resorted to human wave tactics from the start, it was only a matter of time before the legionnaires ran out of supplies altogether. The position was needless to say overrun rather quickly, and the French soldiers defending it were massacred. Only a few men like the legionnaire running through the jungles of Indochina were spared the slaughter that ensued, but if they could not outrun their pursuers, then their temporary escape was utterly devoid of meaning. Being hunted like a feral hog, the enemy soldiers made use of traps and tracking tactics to chase the French legionary from ambush point to ambush point, each contact with the enemy adding the number of wounds on his flesh. Despite this, the soldier continued with his efforts, fleeing into the woods and hoping to reach the last major evacuation point to flee the region with the rest of the French soldiers who were sick and tired of their deployment and the suicidal orders they were expected to fulfill. But the journey was far, and evidently the enemy was already aware of their intentions, planning to cut off the escape route of those who dared to flee the battlefield. Screams of agony accompanied the sounds of gunfire and detonated explosives. Where the native languages of the French legionnaires cried out in terror, no doubt pleading for mercy, as they were permanently silenced by their hunters. Until finally it all ceased. Alone, lost in the jungle, surrounded on all sides, the lone survivor suddenly realized that he had no idea where he was, or what direction went where. No, he was well and truly isolated. Finally, the Japanese soldiers, concealing their bodies with mud, paint, and natural foliage, emerged with their weapons in hand and bayonets attached, the leader of which had a katana drawn and in an aggressive high guard. As the men surrounded the legionary, he raised his machine gun and shouldered it, squeezing the trigger as he aimed down the sights of the weapon towards the nearest target. Click! Having randomly fired his weapon with bursts into the treeline to try and deter his attackers from following him, the soldier only now realized that his weapon was empty and he had not changed the belt. Causing the nearest attacker, he tried to shoot, to lunge forward with his bayonet attached to the weapon of his rifle. Using the larger size of the machine gun to block his vitals, the French soldier pushed the Japanese soldier back with his weapon before drawing his own bayonet as he lunged towards his enemy with the blade in his hand, as if it were a knife. Skewering the Japanese soldier in the chest as he did so, while screaming at the enemy in perfect American English. "Come on, you yellow bastards. You want me? Well, here I am. Come and fucking get some." A flash of shimmering steel, glistening with the mists of the Indo-Chinese jungle, lunged towards the American volunteer, himself only narrowly avoiding a death blow while sacrificing one of his legs and his spare arm. In doing so, he stuck his bayonet into the neck of the nearest soldier, which he grabbed hold of and repeatedly poked with his blade, before slashing his weapon wildly, creating enough room to make an attempt of deflecting the oncoming stab. But there was only so much the man could do, as an entire squad was simultaneously attacking him with their bayonets at the same time, causing him to temporarily become a human pincushion. With his last vestige of life ebbing away from his body, the legionnaire spit on the officer who had shoved his sword into the American volunteer's gut, causing him to become agitated as he withdrew his sword from where it currently lay, and with a single smooth gesture decapitated the dying soldier in front of him. After doing so, the Japanese raged at the dead man who had spit on his face. Fucking English pricks. They really should know when to give up. One of the nearby soldiers looked at his commanding officer with confusion as the officer mutilated the corpse in front of him further, before saying the words that made the officer regret his immediate and violent behavior. "Sir," he sounded American, not English. Horrified that he may have just violated the strict order given regarding American volunteers and how to handle them with care, the Japanese infantry officer looked over at his subordinate with a grim expression on his face before demanding a certain answer. "What did you say just now? He's American? Not English. How can you tell? You better not be lying to me, Corporal." The corporal was quick to respond with certainty as he said words which caused horror to rapidly spread across the surviving members of their squad as it dawned upon them what they had just done. "I have family who immigrated to California decades ago. I spent vacations during my youth visiting them. I know the difference between an Englishman and an American when I hear it. Check to see if he has any ID." The officer quickly ordered the privates to do so, where they found not only an American driver's license on the man, but also photos of him standing in front of the Statue of Liberty with his lover back home. It was fine to kill an enemy soldier who refused to surrender, but violating their corpses afterwards was a flagrant disregard for the rules of war, and the entirety of the Japanese military had been given strict orders to avoid doing so to volunteers from neutral nations, the United States in particular being a great concern. Though the squad would try to cover up their misdeeds, there were also those who would rat on their brothers in arms and comrades if enough pressure was applied to them, and in the right way. Soon enough, this matter would become public and would incite the more hawkish citizens of the United States into advocating for war, if not outright aid to be given to France. Japan had gift-wrapped an early Christmas present and sent it right to Woodrow Wilson's front desk. By asking for volunteers from the United States Armed Forces stationed in the Philippines and unofficially offer them to the French Foreign Legion without the proper procedures. Hawkish elements of the American Armed Forces were able to send armed and trained soldiers to French Indochina under the guise of being neutral, allowing for ships to pass through the region unimpeded by the naval forces of the Central Powers present in the region. The operation had started small-scale, with a few companies' worth of American volunteers being strategically inserted into the right place at the right time, and it had paid off. The French unit which these Americans were officially serving with under the capacity of being deserters denied American involvement in the conflict, while setting up the scene for the brutality which the Japanese were known to engage in. After all, the Japanese had no intelligence of American soldiers coming over to take part in the French Foreign Legion's futile resistance, and thus had acted without regard for the possibility. But by doing so, they had played right into Wilson's hand, and now every newspaper in America would be reporting on the brutal execution and dismemberment of a U.S. soldier in French Indochina by the Imperial Japanese Army. Sure, this may not by itself stir up the support from the public necessary to undo over a decade of societal conditioning towards isolationism and neutrality, but it would be enough to spark a desire for greater volunteer support to aid France and hopefully break the German advance and force them either into a stalemate or reverse their advantage altogether. This was Woodrow Wilson's hope, to buy himself enough time to win the presidency and get the United States and its industrial potential into the war against Germany and the Central Powers. However, he was running against the clock, and the possibility of this provocation being simply too late on America's part to change the tides of war was a very real possibility. Chapter 372, Too Little Too Late. Bruno had been given the greatest honor by the Kaiser, and that was operational command of the entire Western Front, the only major front left that Germany really cared about. As a result, he was no longer given the option to command in the field, and the German 8th Army he had been in command of now fell to the control of Heinrich, who by now was a lieutenant general. As a result, Bruno would be spending the majority of what remained of the war far enough away from enemy lines to be threatened by the enemy, but close enough to maintain full control over every front and the forces of the Central Powers located there. Because he was no longer stationed at the chaos of the front, Bruno had easy access to ongoing news around the globe. Hence, he immediately heard about what happened in French Indochina and the field day the United States press, who was not under his control, were having with it. But it was too little too late. The French lines had broken. Their country was on fire, suffering from internal revolt, while the countryside was ravaged with brigandry. The newly formed conscripted army designed to hold the line, having received poor training, equipment, and severely lacking in the robust chain of command their adversaries had, especially at the NCO level, made for widespread routes and desertion whenever the French army made contact with the Central Powers. If there was one thing this war had taught Bruno, or perhaps I should say reinforced his modern knowledge, it was that a highly trained professional army was always better than a force of conscripts. Either way, Wilson's attempts to drag the United States out of isolation and spark a war with the Central Powers was a futile one. At the current rate, Bruno would be parading through Paris within a fortnight at the latest, and because of this he could only smirk and snicker upon reading all about what the Americans had planned. Perhaps if you had won the 1912 election, you may have been able to get troops and supplies on European soil in time to stall the inevitable. But unfortunately for you, it is now too little, too late. After saying this to nobody in particular, Bruno folded up the paper on his lap neatly and stashed it away. Having done this, he approached the command center that was established within Germany territory near the western border within France. Casualty reports were flooding in, and while the soldiers of the Central Powers had sustained minimal losses thus far in their current push, the French army's figures were staggering, increasing by the thousands per second. One thing was certain: by the time this war came to an end and peace was secured, France in its current state would not survive the immediate aftermath. No, they were likely to fracture and wage war against itself, similar to the troubles the Weimar Republic found itself having early on within its existence during Bruno's past life. As Bruno gazed upon the updated numbers spread across the telegraph, he was quick to ask about the current state of the war effort. It would appear our forces are not relenting in their pursuit of a quick finish. Good. Tell me, how quickly will it take for our forces to surround and besiege Paris? The communications officer did not even realize that Bruno had entered the room, quickly snapping to attention as they did so before responding with the information he wanted, thus confirming the calculations he had already made in his head. At the current rate of the war, 2 weeks at the latest. However, it is entirely possible the French will begin to surrender the moment they see our armor passing by, as we have come across several cases of such behavior already. If these immediate surrenders become more commonplace or even the norm among the French army, then we will probably see a victory in 72 hours at the earliest. The French have exhausted their ability to wage war by throwing waves after wave of men at our fortified borders, and now they are merely within their death throes, having a last gasp before they are finished once and for all. I have to say, your strategy of forcing the French to attack us repeatedly and over the course of the war bleeding them dry of manpower and resources has worked flawlessly. Bruno simply responded to this remark with a silent nod of his head before giving the men within the room further orders. Well, if anything changes, keep me posted. After saying this, Bruno walked off, suddenly finding himself incredibly bored with his current lot in life. Life far away from the front lines seemed less than ideal for a man of his character, having spent his entire professional career as a military officer who led from the front and by example. He was now finding himself having a hard time adjusting to his current position. Sure, he had been allowed to do as he saw fit in the past, largely because of the power and influence he wielded, but as the war intensified, and rumors of Bruno's reckless behavior reached the Kaiser's ears, was it really any wonder he was finally ordered to behave in accordance with his current position? One stray shell at any given time, or one lucky sniper, and Bruno could be dealt a fatal blow, one that would cause irreparable damage to the German Reich's war machine. Such a thing could not be permitted to happen, and thus he was given a stern talking to by the Kaiser before he departed for war this time around. Logically, Bruno understood the Kaiser's reasoning. Weapons had developed towards such destructive ends that the era of generals and kings leading armies had vanished, instead replaced with a system where these generals, especially the highest-ranking ones, never stepped foot on the battlefields on which they sent their soldiers to die upon. And since this was the case, Bruno decided to spend the next few weeks regarding his plans for the future now that he had guaranteed a Central Powers victory within the Great War. Whether it was facilitating the annexation of the Österreich into the German Reich, or it was establishing long-term and permanent relations with the Romanovs through the marriage of his offspring. In addition to this, there was the matter of what to do with the German colonies after the Great War came to an end. Frankly speaking, Bruno felt it would be both wise and prudent to begin a peaceful and long-term process of decolonization, as he felt the risks they posed to overall stability and economic prominence was far greater than it was worth maintaining direct control over them. While reflecting on this particular question, Bruno understood that there were lessons to be learned from his past life, particularly the diplomatic efforts nations of the BRICS economic alliance had made in this regard. With this in mind, Bruno decided that he would pursue a long-term dynastic alliance between the House of Hohenzollern and Romanov, using his own bloodline as the glue that kept them together. This would cement an economic and military alliance that would guarantee damn near self-sufficiency for the two empires even against a world of enemies. At the same time, it would allow for the use of debt-trap diplomacy and state-backed mercenary forces to gain control over former colonial resources and ensure that the puppet state in the area maintained control while paying Germany and Russia to do so. Yes, there were a lot of lessons to be learned from Bruno's past life, especially in the decades and century that were to come from the current era, and Bruno intended to use this knowledge for the benefit of the fatherland. Especially now that he had the time to do so, having been removed from the front lines of war and sent into a more administrative position located at the safety of the rear. Perhaps he was celebrating too early, but from his perspective the United States had tried to force its involvement in the war a bit too late to have any actual impact on the result. Even if they did manage to get a ship full of foreign volunteers and supplies past the blockade around France, there was little they could do to change the outcome. Thus it was indeed, as Bruno had said, too little, too late. As for how Woodrow Wilson and his camp of zealous hawks would react when realizing they had responded too late, well, let's just say it would either tank their prospects for election, and thus solidifying the efforts Bruno had spent the last decade subverting American politics, or it would end in a bolstering of his own party, and would see fit that the Americans would begin playing a much larger part in global politics. Should this occur, Bruno would have a new player to contend with on the global stage. But that was a story for another time. Chapter 373, The Home Front. While the enemies of the German Reich burned in the aftermath of war, having pushed their industry and agriculture to the edge all for the sake of a feudal resistance, the fatherland prospered like never before. Their economy largely guided by the state, and its ties to the military-industrial complex had ballooned from the increased volume of output and sales, not only to their own armed force, but also to their allies who had begun a process of standardization of equipment in line with the German army for the sake of the ease of logistics. And while Austro-Hungary was still feeling the heat of the Balkans ready to ignite at a moment's notice into a great fire, the German Reich and Russian Empire were largely unaffected by the war. Losses had been well below the replacement rate, and soldiers were routinely given leave to rest from the horrors of war. Meanwhile, the people flourished in their work, generating a large amount of wealth for the nation. Would this boom last forever? Of course not. And could it easily cripple the nation after the war was over? Oh yes. But plans were already in place to begin transitioning towards civilian industries that could maintain the output of the war for more sustainable production. Thus life continued in the unmolested lands of the German fatherland, much as they had before the war. In fact, in Bruno's household there were subtle changes taking place. Heidi had been preoccupied with her charities and the daily function of her family that she had forgotten that her son Erwin's 14th birthday was rapidly approaching. Why was this so important? Because in the German Reich a man could marry at the age of 14 with parental consent. And considering his fiancée was roughly 9 years older than him, Heidi intended to have her eldest son properly married before waiting until he was a proper 21 years of age. Because of this, now that she finally had a day to herself, she approached Alya, who was staying with her family, as the Russian beauty always did whenever her adopted father is off to war. There was a book in Heidi's hands that she had prepared years in advance for this day. The information within it contained everything needed to plan a proper wedding, and thus she approached the young woman, who was in the act of helping around the house, catching her entirely off guard. "Alya dear, can I have a moment to speak with you?" Isla was most certainly confused why her godmother and future mother-in-law would come to find her when it was the woman's day off, but she was quick to react respectfully as she did so. "Of course, mother, what do you need?" Heidi shoved the book into Alya's hands and showed off all that she had prepared. "Erwin will be turning 14 soon, and because of this, I intend to have your wedding planned for the spring of next year. By then, both your father and his will be home to witness it. I think it will be a great celebration for the family after the war has been won to see the eldest son of our house married off to our beloved goddaughter. Don't you think?" Alya was indeed shocked by this sudden revelation. She had known for years that she would be marrying Erwin, and was naturally aware of the laws regarding marriage in the German Reich. Still, she had always felt like the day was an eternity away. Erwin was still just a boy in her eyes. Sure, he was rapidly turning into a man she could only hope to be worthy of one day. But even now he was still young, having just recently hit a growth spurt and acquiring a height greater than her own. But when she really thought of it, she would be 23 years old when they married, and she did not want to have to wait until her late 20s or, God forbid, her early 30s before the two of them could seal the deal. With all of this weighing on the young woman's mind, it took her a second to realize there was a deeper significance to Heidi's meaning. Bruno and Heinrich had endured a lot in this war, as had every man who participated in it, and they, like many others, had lost a very close friend. Hell, Alya herself felt that sting as she lost a man who was her second godfather. The marriage ceremony would be a way to help bring the men of war back to a mindset capable of adapting to the world of peace they would have created with their blood and sweat and tears. And when this realization slowly dawned on her, Isla found no reason to postpone the inevitable and was quick to wear a bitter smile as she nodded her head, wiping a single tear from her eyes as she thought of all the loss of life she had endured, both in her childhood in Russia and here and now as an adult in Germany. There was a solemn tone in her voice as she nodded and forced a more natural smile. "I think that's a beautiful idea, Mother. Let me take a look at what you have planned." The two women then looked over all the details of the wedding, including its venue, which would take place in Berlin's most beautiful cathedral. Everything planned was very traditional for a Prussian wedding, and the dress Heidi had prepared for her future daughter-in-law was gracefully styled to the latest fashion trends. By the time they had agreed on everything they wanted for the day, they began to make all the preparations necessary for the time and date. Neither Bruno, Heinrich, nor the groom in question would be aware that the wedding was set in stone until after the war came to an end, which seemed to be rapidly approaching. In contrast to Germany and Russia, which had suffered minimal losses in this war when compared both to the enemies they were fighting, as well as the previous timeline, the Allies had been dealt a far more brutal hand. Lands ravaged by combat, populations displaced from war, and millions upon millions of men lie dead from battle. And that was not including those civilians who starved to death or died of disease, and exhaustion was common during such eras of strife. The war had ravaged Britain, France, Serbia, and the former lands of the Ottoman Empire. And while countries like Bulgaria and Italy were less so affected due to the swiftness of their surrender, they still lost sizable enough chunks of their population to create a burden on survivors. Outside of a few examples in history, war was generally hell for both sides of the conflict, and the people within the nations involved were not free from experiencing some form of suffering as, or at the very least difficulty as a result. For a war of this scale, it was unprecedented for only one side's civilian populations to be suffering on the home front. And this was no greater displayed than the countrysides of the British homeland, where soldiers returned from the war found their homes vacant and their loved ones buried in the local cemetery. Miraculously, they had survived the hell of the trenches only to find that starvation and disease had done their families in. It was perhaps the worst hell a soldier could come home to, knowing that each day you are likely to be the next to die, only to have the relief of surviving long enough to return home. Yet the moment you enter the doors of your childhood home, you find a mother, or a father, or a brother and sister missing. Or perhaps, if you were particularly unlucky, all the above. Not killed by the cold steel of a bayonet, or a gunshot to the chest, or an unsuspecting artillery strike in the middle of the night, like all of your brothers in arms you had witnessed perish while on the battlefield far from home, but instead, dead by the nation's failure to produce food, or medicine in sufficient enough quantity for its people's needs. Such betrayal was far too great for a man who had just come home from war to reasonably bear. And that was exactly what happened to Bernard Montgomery. In Bruno's past life, he would make a name for himself in the Great War and be heavily decorated for his efforts, where he would go on to serve as one of the Empire's better generals during the Second World War decades later. Currently, the man stood in a cemetery, the rain pouring on his head as he gazed upon the graves of his family, who had died the same way that many of the men in uniform around him had lost their loved ones. There was a look of deep lament and suffering in his eyes as he stood silently for a long while, before finally placing his cap on his head and turning away. However, if one were to see him after doing so, they would see his pain replaced entirely with the fire of rage, a flame that would consume the world if left unchecked. And there were many others with such a fierce glint in their eyes who would leave this cemetery, and many others like it, on this day, and those still to come. Chapter 374, Let It Burn. The lines continued to fold in France as the Germans and their allies continued to march forward with overwhelming momentum and power. Like a thunder strike, they marched and they marched, obliterating every enemy position in their path. With the nation's shores blockaded by the navies of the Central Powers, there was really only one way to escape the chaos, through the Pyrenees into Spain. A treacherous journey, which thousands, or perhaps even millions, had opted to take. Of course, when the first few thousand illegal French migrants made their way to Spain, nobody truly batted an eye. But when the numbers became far more troublesome, the Kingdom of Spain sent its army to the borders to stem the tide of would-be refugees who would overwhelm an already unstable and chaotic system. To describe Spain in this era and its internal politics was a difficult feat. While calling themselves a monarchy, they lacked all the stability that typically came with such governments. Rather, the real power lied with their electoral system, which was prone to unchecked fraud, allowing sweeping and unilateral transitions between parties of widely different ideologies and policies in every election cycle. Whoever had the ability to commit the most voter fraud usually ended up in power until someone else could supplant them with the same methods. As a result, the government was riddled with corruption, instability, and plenty of economic problems. It was an impossibility for the Spanish to take care of French refugees, and they were not willing to entertain the thought. As a result, France continued to burn in the background while the German Eighth Army and its fellow combined arms counterparts surrounded Paris within a week of offensive. An ultimatum was quickly given to what remained of the French government. Surrender or die. What remained of the French army that had not already been destroyed, captured, or routed into desertion was held up within the city, planning to make a last stand in their capital rather than surrender. Even so, Bruno had given the order to request a formal surrender and disarmament, as the idea of going door-to-door fighting in every building within the city was something that he feared would cause millions of casualties on his own end. Because of this, there was a cold air within Paris and its immediate vicinity as those posed to wager their life in this futile battle prayed that the leaders of the Third French Republic could be reasoned with. Bruno would rather level Paris and plant the flag of the German Reich over its ashes than entertain the idea of sending millions of the men beneath his command to risk their lives storming the city. This was not the Battle of Berlin, and it did not need to be. As a result, he was quick to take a train from Alsace-Lotharing into Berlin so that he could meet with the Kaiser and repropose his previous offer to end the war swiftly. When Bruno entered the command center of the German army's general staff, he was surprised to find that the Kaiser was standing there celebrating over drinks with his generals, boasting about their grand victory. Wilhelm had even handed Bruno a glass of champagne and personally congratulating him for his role in the war. "My friend, together, we have done the unthinkable. In a single week, we have so humbled the French they are now forced to grovel for our mercy. Once thought to be among the greatest of Europe's powers, brought to heel by your perfect strategy. It is truly marvelous. Come, let us celebrate together." Bruno was stunned to hear this. From what the Kaiser said, it sounded like the French had accepted the terms presented to them, and because of this he was quick to ask if anything had happened while he was on the train. "I'm confused. Did France officially surrender while I couldn't be reached?" It was now everyone else's turn to be perplexed as they looked around at one another and shrugged before the Kaiser clarified why they were all celebrating. "Not yet, no? But why wouldn't they? The war is over. They wouldn't really push us to fight for every city block of Paris now, would they?" Bruno sighed and shook his head, cursing beneath his breath before clarifying that the French government might indeed make such an action, while explaining the reasoning and consequences for doing so. If they have not formally surrendered, the war is still being waged, and millions of our men are advancing onto Paris right now to reinforce the 2nd and 8th armies to ensure we can take the city from the citizens within, whom our intelligence suggests are all armed and ready to fight till the last breath. We need to act decisively now, to at the very least intimidate the French into recognizing that we have the means to level their capital and kill everyone in it, and that we are not bluffing. I will burn Paris to the ground before I send those men to their deaths fighting against those who are too mad to see they have already lost. Their damned pride won't allow them to admit defeat, and they still hope they can break us as Paris, or hold on long enough for the Americans to come to the rescue. Give me the order, and I will level the outskirts of Paris with the shells I told you about. I will turn it to ash and plant our flag above, while letting those bastards know we have enough to do the same to the rest of their beloved city." The Kaiser was bewildered by the frenzy in Bruno's eyes, and some of the other generals thought this might be an opportunity to drive a wedge between him and the Kaiser, as they felt Bruno had seized too much power over the military during this war. One of them was quick to make this attempt by placating on the sense of rationality the French should have to see that defeat was certain. "Don't listen to him, my Kaiser. General Feldmarschall von Zehntner here is clearly being pushed to the brink of madness by this war. He might be suffering from shell shock. We don't need to do a thing, and victory will be ours." There were several other highly influential generals, especially those among the old nobility, who were quick to side with the general who made this statement of defamation towards Bruno, and no doubt the Wolf of Prussia was quick to remember their faces and names for future reference. However, one man instantly stepped forward and defended Bruno while it was becoming clear that the majority of the general staff were turning against him, now that they believed the war was already won, and that Bruno would need to be knocked down a peg or two in this transition to peace. The one to take Bruno's side in a room full of enemies was none other than the legendary German General Feldmarschall August von Mackensen, who tapped Bruno's shoulder and nodded to him before making his thoughts known. "The young wolf is right. Our intelligence has confirmed France intends to fight into the bloody end. It is not guaranteed they have yet to see reason despite their current fall from grace. A show of force may be necessary to secure the results we desire, lest we may find ourselves losing more men taking Paris than we have lost so far throughout this damned war." The Kaiser looked at the two factions that had quickly formed in the room. On the one side was Bruno and von Mackensen's faction, the young nobles who had earned their titles and positions through meritorious service to the state. On the other were those from long-standing noble families, with extensive military legacy. Their real objective here and now was to hinder Bruno's power and prestige as the German Reich transitioned from an era of war to one of peace. Obviously, the Kaiser had made long-term plans to keep Bruno and his family by his dynasty's side, and thus he was about to naturally make a choice who to support when a page ran into the room and alerted them to France's response. "France has declined our request for their surrender and demanded that if we want them to lay down their arms, we will have to come and take them ourselves." Bruno looked over at the old fools who had tried to take a stand against him with a sense of disdain, while recognizing the loyalty of those who had stuck by him here and now, pleading with the Kaiser to give the order. "My Kaiser, I beg of you for a third time now. Let me show the enemy what we are really capable of." Wilhelm had found himself in a rock and a hard place. He understood the terrifying nature of the weapons Bruno had described, and also knew it would likely be enough to at the very least force the individual soldiers of the French army to lay down their arms. And thus, he was ultimately compelled to make a difficult decision in order to spare as many of their own men as possible. So be it. Let it burn. Chapter 375. The End of a Great War. Having been given approval from the Kaiser to teach the world a powerful reminder about who had become the supreme hegemon of the coming century in this world, Bruno immediately gave the order to break the cluster shells out of storage and to bring them to bear on Paris, specifically its outskirts. Wanting to prove a point and not cause any unnecessary suffering to the innocent civilians who had been caught up in the madness of their failed government, Bruno spent the time it took to transfer these shells to the front line, having the German Air Force drop flyers on the city, basically stating that they would begin shelling the outskirts within the next few days as a result of France's stubborn refusal to surrender. These flyers were written in French and were naturally there to get the civilians out of Dodge before the attack could begin, giving them both the option of doing so to surrender to the Germans and be cared for until Paris surrendered, or flee further into the city where they would be safe from the attack. Naturally, Bruno had suspected the possibility that Paris would become a new Berlin and would fight until the last man. Thus, these flyers were already printed in sufficient quantities well in advance of the city's encirclement. Eventually, the shells arrived, and so too did Bruno with them. Not wanting to miss the fireworks of his latest weapon, Bruno approached Heinrich and the other general officers safely at the rear of the siege camp and was swiftly greeted with a respectful salute. "General Feldmarschall, we were not expecting your presence here. Have you come all this way just to witness us shell a few empty buildings?" Bruno scoffed as he gazed through his binoculars towards the city's outermost layer, quick to ensure there was nobody left behind during their attack. After which he responded to the question with an almost amusing tone in his voice. "No, I have come to witness your army light a ring of fire around Paris. Let us see how much resolve the individual soldiers trying desperately to defend this city still have when they realize that hell has come to Paris and has brought its demons with it. So long as the flyers have been distributed over the course of the last few days as I ordered you all to do so, then we have given enough notice. Anyone left behind does so knowing the risk. Begin the assault." The flyers had indeed been distributed over the last few days, and the Germans had accepted many Parisian refugees, giving them a safe place to stay, while clothing and feeding them, as many appeared malnourished from the ongoing effects the war was having on their country. As a result, the cluster shells, which were loaded into thousands of guns which surrounded the city of varying sizes, such as 10.5 centimeters, 15 centimeters, 17 centimeters, and 21 centimeters guns opened fire on their precise coordinates. The shells flew through the air at such a high velocity that nobody had time to witness their ascent, nor could they see the shells break apart into small balls which belted the French landscape, igniting into napalm, sending streaks of fire high into the skies as they did so. And the barrage would continue for 3 hours, creating a terrifying ring of fire surrounding the city in its entirety and burning everything within its destructive wake completely to ash. From the perspective of what remained of the French government, they had spent the last few months fortifying their city and ensuring that its people would defend them until the last man. They were quite confident that their enemy would grow sick of bleeding for every inch of Parisian soil, and in doing so would come to the negotiating table with far more favorable terms than an unconditional surrender. Thus these elected officials were swirling their cognac and eating what remained of France's fine cheese while the rest of its people starved, celebrating their perceived victory, at least until the first round of shells was fired precisely around Paris in a way that created a ring of fire around it. When the flames appeared through the windows of the Palais Bourbon, the men damn near choked to death on their spirits. At first, they thought they were perhaps seeing things, until the overwhelming heat spread through the city as the napalm continued to burn, and the fire spread. The weapons Bruno had chosen were napalm-based cluster munitions, and napalm was notorious for spreading rapidly. Anything touched by the highly flammable substance it would stick to, and if you tried to pat it out like a normal fire, it would only spread further. It was a horrific substance that the world had only seen used in German flamethrowers up until this point. From the perspective of the French government, their city was now surrounded by a wall of fire, and that wall was slowly beginning to spread inward as more shells exploded and spread the highly flammable and viscous substance everywhere. The French politicians immediately began to panic. That is until a servant ran in and handed them a piece of paper which contained a telegraph sent to them by the commander of the German army, which surrounded the city. It had 2 sentences written on it, but the intent behind them was clear enough to break the will of the French government and what remained of its army that had stood so defiant for so long. I wonder if you will continue to be obstinate until your beloved city and everything in it is turned to ash. That would be quite a sight to witness. Nobody in the French government had suspected Bruno to be so ruthless. Although the official cause of his actions at Belgrade was because the city would not surrender, the most powerful figures in the world knew it was really a message towards those lurking in the shadows, that his people were not to be touched. And he had decided to use the headquarters of the Black Hand who had so thoroughly provoked his ire to prove this point. But now, there were many who were suspecting there was some truth to the matter, that Bruno would rather annihilate an entire city than send millions of his men to fight for control of each building. The French politicians stared at one another with a mixture of complicated emotions. Despair, fear, fury, and hatred all began to overwhelm them. Some cursed, others panicked, and a few even began to cry as they drank their sorrows away. In the end, the French president, Raymond Poincaré, looked upon those who had sided with him and refused to surrender, and shook his head, sighing heavily as he gave the unthinkable order to surrender. I will not have 1,000 years of our people's heritage and pride burned to ash overnight. I will not be the president who saw Paris removed from the map and all of human history. No, I must confess, I did not expect the Wolf of Prussia to take such shameless measures in order to preserve the lives of his men. But it is clear to me now, we are dealing with a man who cares more about those beneath his command than the millions of innocent men, women, and children who oppose him. If it were anyone else, I would call his bluff. As with Belgrade in 1914, we too now face the possibility of total annihilation, and this time he does not intend to preserve our history, as the man has deemed us unworthy of such grace. I hereby invoke my powers as President of France to order an immediate surrender of all hostilities. All men and boys carrying arms must immediately drop them, and allow the German soldiers to ensure a peaceful transition to the end of this war. Any soldier caught defying these orders will be imprisoned and executed as traitors of the nation. Now go and alert the Germans of what I have said before they burn the entire city to the fucking ground. After Germany's recon planes confirmed the French army had disarmed and entered a state of surrender, Bruno had the order for their planes to fly overhead and give the inflamed regions of Paris a chemical bath that put out the flames immediately upon contact. Chemicals fell from the sky, much like a crop duster, and put the raging napalm to rest, revealing the scorched earth below and the ashes that remained of what had existed prior. When it was determined safe to continue, the German soldiers waiting outside the city began their advance into Paris. The German 8th and 2nd Armies began their march through the French capital, securing every soldier, every firearm, and every munition stockpile within the city, before Bruno would march up to the Palace of Versailles and climb its hallowed steps, raising the banners of the German Reich above it, and claiming a supreme victory for the Central Powers. In doing so, ending the Great War in his new lease on life and accomplishing what he had been preparing a lifetime to face. Though the Great War had finally come to an end, after much bloodshed, the world that would come was far from secure, and the German Reich would need direct guidance on how to steer these turbulent waters in order to ensure the future that Bruno and God desired came to fruition.